Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I was 12 years old at the time, young, whimsical, naive, very impressionable. I was staying over at the Higgs family home. Both my parents had been invited to the Higgs for a dinner party. They unfortunately hadn't been able to find a babysitter for us, so at the last minute we'd been brought along, rather like that unfortunate excess baggage that you can never rid yourself of. Subsequently we had been offloaded, kindly invited to stay overnight at our generous hosts, who had insisted we were more than welcome to stay over there, be collected in the morning by our parents. Me and my two sisters, Jacqueline and Fiona, played with our hosts, Vanessa and Stephen Higgs' own children, Lena and Bobby, who were 11 and 12 years old at the time, so roughly about the same ages as me and my younger siblings. We were currently all in attendance at the very same private school, as indeed the Higgs were part of the school lift club. I really liked Vanessa Higgs. I found her to be an easy-going, fun-loving woman. I often engaged in long talks with her when she picked us up from school and took us back home, while the other kids tended to sit back in the truck, never saying a single word. That evening, me, my sisters and the two Higgs children had entertained ourselves together by playing a game of Monopoly. I had fortuitously gained 5 hotels on the expensive dark blue section, which included the esteemed Broadwalk and Park Place properties on the game board, which had auspiciously enabled me to win the game, a fact that did not go down well with my two competitive sisters, as they were used to effaciously winning in life, as losing for them was never an agreeable option, something my mother had effectually ingrained in their psyche from a very young age, while I, on the other hand, was well used to failing abysmally, something that made my jaundiced mother very disenchanted and embittered about. I sensed this had made her less than enamoured with me growing up. I had discerned from a very young age the very ill-omened distinct whiff of preferential treatment blowing on the wind, a noxious, unpleasant smell I chose to wilfully ignore, but sometimes things you brush under the carpet can't remain obscure or insignificant for very long. I had not failed to notice my two sisters getting special treatment like that extra helping of ice cream at the dinner table, which growing up hurt me a lot. After our Monopoly game had finished that night, we engaged in a rather exciting pillow fight where we fought each other in our pyjamas. The pillows burst open, which meant everything, including our hair, was covered with white feathers. The place looked as if a fox had entered a chicken coop, causing macabre devastation, absolute mayhem everywhere, although fortunately there were no carcasses of dead birds, only feathers, and still more feathers. Finally, after pleading extreme physical exhaustion, after overexertion of physically killing ourselves with pillows, we subsequently retired to our sleeping bags, where all 5 of us kids had arranged to sleep on the floor of my friend's bedroom, inside a large pop-up tent. We made the interior terribly cosy, aligning all our sleeping bags together in one long row, along with plenty of soft feathery pillows, to create a makeshift den. I was awoken to the sound of my name being spoken. It's amazing how even when you drift off to sleep, if you sense your name being discussed, it's much more than likely to grab your attention. It certainly did mine. I awoke with a start, while the sea of bodies scattered around me were fast asleep, snoring gently. Although my sister Jacqueline was snoring as she had to date, the strangest snore I've ever heard. I remember tape recording it once for her. She was convinced I'd recorded a farmyard pig oinking, but I assured her that that was what she sounded like when she was fast asleep, an unfortunate fact which really mortified her. As I sat up in my sleeping bag, I distinctly heard my mother talking about me. My ears were naturally flapping. I wanted to know what she was saying about me. I had an uneasy, disturbing feeling that whatever she was saying was not good. I surreptitiously, cautiously crept down the passage, peeking into the living room, where the couples were gathered together for coffee and after-dinner aperitifs. I could see my mother's legs were crossed over each other in a very feminine way. She was wearing a short emerald green dress, with white buttons down the centre, the hemline ending well above her knees. She had long, slender, shapely legs, which she considered her most prized assets. She was forever showing them off. My mother had always been a huge social climber, who was full of airs and graces, especially when we were in places where she had a respectable audience, so that most people would get the impression that she hung around in the circles of the rich and famous, even though that wasn't true at all. Ostensibly, she liked people to think that that was most certainly the case. I think they call it inverted snobbery. She liked to give the impression that she might be indirectly related to the Queen in some way, and often would make comments to make people believe she was some distant relative of hers, as my mother enjoyed name-dropping, as easily as seagulls' anal discharges. My mother turned on her pretentious display, rather like a peacock strutting its feathers, saying, "Look at me! Aren't I completely fabulous?" I could see one of the men at the dinner party was a very stylish gentleman, wearing a waistcoat, a cravat, and an exceedingly smart pair of tailored pants. He was in his early 60s. I noticed his face was graced with a distinguished, salient, genteel, walrus-like moustache. He had the distinct, dignified signature look of the famous legendary detective Hercule Poirot, with similar dark discerning eyes, sharp, penetrating, piercing, that were clearly astute, shrewd, and judicious. They missed nothing, rather like an owl studying an unsuspecting mouse from high up on a branch. I watched him from my hiding place, where I had stealthily sneaked behind the large sofa to eavesdrop in on the adults' conversation. I remembered this prudent, savvy gentleman opened a box of very extravagant Cuban cigars, removing one big fat cigar from its elegant cellophane packaging. I watched him light up the cigar, which he popped into his mouth. He began puffing out wisps of smoke, while studying my mother curiously, with a percipient interest. I didn't get the impression that he was bedazzled by her, as most men usually were. My mother was an attractive woman, who flaunted her looks as if they were extravagant pearls that she was eager to show off. The look the Hercule Poirot look-alike gave my mother was one of distinct disapproval, as if he had insightfully got the full measure of her, had figured out what she was all about, as if she would never be able to pull the wool over his sagacious, pragmatic eyes. For much like the character Hercule Poirot, the famous Belgian detective, he had that discerning, wizened look of a man well acquainted and rather accomplished with all aspects of nonsensical human behaviour. My mother, with her very white bottle-blonde hair, pushed a long lock behind her ears, reclasping the diamante clip again, which she often did as a nervous habit. Then she said, "Well, you know, when you have kids, there's always one that, let's just say, you don't like very much." "What do you mean?" said my mother's friend Vanessa, taking a sip of her coffee, studying my mother rather curiously through her beady brown eyes. My mother took a dainty sip of her coffee. Then she put it down gracefully on the coffee table. "Well, you know, if I'm being totally candid, I may be rather indelicate when I say this. You know, one that you don't really love as much as the others. I suppose the best word to use is black sheep of the family. Now, I do hate to say it, In truth, I don't believe many parents would dare to say it. Let's just say it's possibly not considered socially acceptable to talk of such undiplomatic things. But if we're being blatantly honest, laying our cards frankly on the table, surely we will admit that there is often one of our kids we almost wish had never been born. I mean, if I was in a situation where I had to choose one kid not to save from our burning house, it would definitely not be my daughter Emma. My mother's friend audibly gasped, cupping her hands over her mouth in astonishment, as if she couldn't quite believe my mother's brazen audacity, while the man with the cigar stared at my overbearing mother with wide, reproachful eyes, while the corners of his mouth turned down into a sizable, reproving frown, as if to say, "You really are a very vulgar woman indeed, just as I thought you were. I think my instincts about you were absolutely dead on the money. You might look attractive on the outside, but your heart is as cold as ice." "Sorry," said my mother's friend Vanessa. "Am I hearing you right? You wish one of your kids had never been born? Is that what you're saying? If it came to rescuing your children from a burning house, the child you like least, you would save last." My mother let out a light laugh. "Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm talking about my daughter Emma. She's a very big faux pas, or should I say disappointment to me. She's not like my other two daughters, you see. I have to say both Jacqueline and my other daughter Fiona, well, they're just the most delightful kids. I can't find any fault with either of them. They do so well at school, get excellent grades, are remarkably good at sports. But my oldest daughter Emma, she's a bitter impediment to me. In truth, sometimes I'm rather ashamed, disillusioned about her. Because, you know, you can't really choose what comes out of your womb, can you?" Tears were gathering in my eyes as I heard my mother talking about me in such a condescending fashion. She was telling everyone she was ashamed of me. It would have been better if I had never been born. I would be the child she would least likely save from a burning building. In truth, I'd always got the impression she distinctly preferred my two siblings, but to hear her brazenly, unabashedly say such things was like a kick to the guts. It truly felt as if she'd lunged a large, sharp dagger into the depths of my heart. What she had said was cruel and heartless. Until that time, I had falsely assumed that both my parents loved me equally, but it seemed that I couldn't have been more wrong about that. This time it was the distinguished gentleman with the cigar who intervened in the conversation. "You should be very careful what you audaciously say about this daughter of yours, Sadie, if you don't mind my saying so. This Emma who disappoints you. It is my experience that often the most unlikely of our children become the shining stars later on in life, as we fail to see their star quality. It's very commonly the case. You mark my words, if you're showing blatant partisanship to your other kids, the one you don't love as much is almost certainly going to feel the unfairness and inequality. That's going to be cutting for her. Besides anything else, such preferential discrimination between your children is atrocious in my opinion." "Shining star," said my mother, virtually spitting out her coffee in disgust. "Please," she said, oscillating her arms in a dismissive gesture. "You obviously haven't met my daughter, Rupert. If you had, you would see that Emma is never going to be a star. That is about as unlikely to happen as the sky turning green or the grass becoming blue." "Why are you so contemptuous and scathing about Emma?" asked Vanessa, looking at my mother earnestly. "Honestly, she strikes me as such a bright, congenial young girl. She's lovely. I think you should be so proud to have a daughter like her. I'd be thrilled if I had a kid like her. She's a very lovely girl." "Bright?" laughed my mother. "Bright? Are you kidding? That daughter of mine is about as dim as a dead star. You should see her grades, not to mention her school reports. They're atrocious. Emma could do better. Emma needs to listen in class. Emma needs to pay attention. My other kids, do you know that what they get in their school reports is fabulous? Fiona is so bright, so attentive. Jacqueline is a first-class pupil. Furthermore, Jacqueline and Fiona get top marks and everything. But Emma, she only gets B's and C's. She's very mediocre, pedestrian, run-of-the-mill. The man with the cigar blew out wisps of smoke towards my mother. Do you know, Sadie, he said to her, Winston Churchill in 1888, I think it was, got such poor entrance exam scores for Harrow that placed him promptly at the very bottom of his class, which was a source of huge embarrassment for his father, I believe. Indeed, he performed very poorly in school, with the exception of history and English composition. In one 2-hour Latin exam he wrote. He only put his name on the exam paper, along with a messy ink splodge, where his fountain pen had unfortunately leaked all over the paper. He also placed the number for the first question down on the page. He in fact left the entire exam completely blank, not answering even one of the questions. So I think he got 1 mark for that exam. So that means he got 1% out of 100. Is that true? Said my mother, looking astonished. Well, I never. Frankly, I am surprised. Who would have thought such a great, remarkable British Prime Minister would be such an atrocious failure at school? But then he must be the exception to that rule. Actually, no, said Rupert. There are many examples of great, rather exemplary people in our illustrious earthly history that never amounted to much in their school years, but blossomed later on in life. Emma may well be one of those surprises. I decided I rather liked Hercule Poirot, well, the man that looked like him. He was sticking up for me, even though he didn't know me from a bar of soap. If I may be so bold as to say, Sadie, I think you are being remarkably unreasonable, somewhat fallacious about your daughter Emma. You're judging her way too harshly, basing her sense of self-worth on her achievements at school. In my humble opinion, that's speculative, short-sighted, and frankly insanely ridiculous. Your daughter Emma may well be the ugly duckling that turns into a swan, if you get my hypothetical drift. It's often the unlikely ones that become the shining stars, as I keep reiterating to you. Well, that's not going to happen to my Emma, said my mother. Never ever. I can see it happening to my Jacqueline and my Fiona. Now they're dazzling stars, in my opinion. What's not going to happen to our Emma? Said my father, overhearing the conversation and taking a seat next to my mother, while sipping into a glass of gin and tonic. I was just saying that Emma is our disappointment. To our family, of course. She's not clever like our other two. What are you talking about? Said my father, looking at my mother in disgust. I know you're disappointed in her grades, darling, but Emma is a very creative young girl. Have you seen how she draws? One day she's going to be quite the most phenomenal artist. And let's not kid. That girl's got a heart on her of pure gold. She has a generous soul. Oh, please, Pierre, do stop talking such nonsense. Emma isn't going to amount to anything. You know it, I know it, we know it. Why don't we quit the pretense and get real? I know Emma very well, said Vanessa. In my opinion, she's your nicest daughter. When I lift your kids up from school, Emma's the one that always talks to me. She's a delightful child, with excellent social skills. Your other two, well, they're a lot less flamboyant, if you don't mind my saying so. You obviously don't know my Jacqueline and Fiona well, said my mother defensively. They're far superior in every way to Emma. I watched as Vanessa and Rupert exchanged private looks together, while my exasperated father rolled his eyes in the back of his head, as though he was somewhat embarrassed by the conversation. I wish you wouldn't talk about Emma like this, he said to my mother. I think it's very inappropriate, your comments about her. They're baseless, and we love our children all exactly the same. That's not what your wife was saying, said Rupert. She was saying that your Emma is the black sheep of your family. Sadie, where is this coming from? My father asked her indignantly. I'm saying what everyone knows to be true. I know that anyone who has kids has favourites. If they say they don't, well, they, quite frankly, are lying through their teeth. I'm saying what other parents haven't got the guts to admit. They worry about what other people think. I, on the other hand, don't care a jot. I'll say it as it is. Well, I love my kids exactly the same, insisted Vanessa. I'm not pretending to love one more than the other. I genuinely love them the same. They're both incredibly precious to me. If anything happened to either one of them, it would tear me apart. Really, said my mother, raising a cynical brow. I don't believe you, Vanessa. If I look at your two children, I would say that Lena is streets ahead of your son, Bobby. I mean, she's got everything, hasn't she? Looks, charm. She's clever. But your boy, Bobby, well, he's nothing special. Jacqueline tells me he's very mainstream and class, middle of the road, so to speak. Whereas Lena, she's pretty close to the top of her class. That girl is going places. How dare you, Sadie? I take offence to you talking about my son Bobby like that. You don't even know the boy. I'll have you know, both my kids are stars. Let's change the subject, said my father, giving my mother dagger looks. I don't think talking about our children is a very good idea. Hear, hear, said Rupert, raising his glass. I'll drink to that. I think we should change the contentious subject, shall we? It's not getting us anywhere. I could see Vanessa looked flustered. My mother's remarks had seriously upset her. She quickly excused herself and disappeared into the kitchen. She was talking on her telephone to her sister Denise. No, I've got Sadie over at the house for dinner. The woman's an absolute nightmare. You know what she actually said to me? Do you know what she said about Bobby? She said he's nothing special compared to my Lena. How dare she say that? I know, can you believe it? Appalling, absolutely appalling. You took the words right out of my head. That was my cue to go right back to bed. But the next morning when my mother picked us up from Vanessa's house, I found that I felt nothing but bitterness and contempt towards her. Knowing how she actually felt about me rarely made my self-esteem plummet, and my sense of self-worth go flying through the window rather like a sparrow trapped in the house. I wanted to tell her what I'd heard her saying about me at the dinner party, but I bit my lips and said nothing. If I had been older and wiser, I would almost certainly have challenged her, valiantly confronted her with what I'd heard her saying about me, how I was the one that she would have preferred not to have been born. I was the one that she was least likely to rescue from a burning building. One day when my mother returned home with a dress for Jacqueline and a dress for my sister Fiona, but nothing for me, it hit me like a brick to the head. She looked at me and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Emma. There wasn't anything in your size," which of course was an outright complete lie. I was exactly the same size as my sister Jacqueline. The way she was talking about me, anyone would think I was the size of a beached whale, and that it was close to impossible to find my size at the shops. If that indeed had been the case, I would have certainly understood, but I knew that my mother's favouritism was unassailable. "Maybe next time, Emma," my mother had said, but I knew next time would be a long time in coming, if ever. I watched with a heart so heavily laden with despondency, as my two sisters proudly paraded around in their pretty sparkling dresses covered in bright sparkling rhinestone jewels, asking me how they looked. "You both look terribly pretty," I said, knowing full well that I could easily have fitted into Jacqueline's dress. I remember going to my bedroom, crying about the unfairness of it all. That was when I promptly decided I would run away from home. If my mother really believed that life would be better off without me, then I would almost certainly go. I didn't want to hang around a place where I wasn't wanted, but then where would I go? I remembered that there was an old abandoned house opposite the Woodgrove, several miles away from our house. I decided to walk there on foot. I quickly emptied out my piggy bank, discovering that I had saved over $100, which was a lot of money in the 80s. That would almost certainly give me a head start, I thought. I grabbed my father's backpack, stuffing it with a sleeping bag, a change of clothes, pyjamas, a torch, some matches, 2 very stout candles, each that had the capacity of burning for 6 solid days straight, without any respite, a tin opener, some cans of beans, tuna, apples, bananas, a loaf of bread, peanut butter, jam, and some chips, and off I went on my merry way. I must have risen out of bed at about 4:30 that morning, when it was still dark outside. I cautiously crept out of the house as quietly as I could. The street was deadly quiet, without a solitary soul in sight, which was rather good, as I didn't want to be seen or observed. The trucks were all parked in their driveways, some were on the street. I walked down the pavement. The light of the street lights along with a half moon lit up the way for me. I could see my way clearly. When I finally arrived at the abandoned house that was built in the middle of the woods, I stood there staring at it, with a mixture of horror and hesitancy. I wasn't sure that this impulsive idea of mine was a good idea after all. In the first light of the morning, where the dark shadows danced across the walls of the whitewashed house, it looked austere and menacing on my approach, rather like a solitary, bad-tempered, grouchy, cantankerous man telling you to clear off. The ambience seemed rather uncongenial, but I wasn't easily put off. Ostensibly rambunctious creepers with minds all of their own were growing wildly, their all-consuming green leafy foliage climbing, meandering, clinging to the house as tightly as an oyster or barnacle attaches itself to a rock. Long ribbons of old paint were peeling away from the walls, while the wooden windows of the house were warped, their frames bent, buckled, virtually crumbling away. I think if you dared to open some of those precarious windows, the whole frame would probably literally become dust in your hands. If there was any good news, the red terracotta roof of the house had mercifully remained intact. I trudged through the long grass and wild weeds that had completely consumed the driveway. Every single part of the house was fringed on every side by tall ponderosa pines and Douglas fir trees that penciled into the sky like tall, skinny, viridescent green giants. I hesitantly made my way to the front door, that appeared to be shabby, badly scuffed and very scratched. It creaked open. I found myself in a living room, where old furniture couches and settees were now threadbare, as if the upholstery had been eaten away by moths. As I walked on the warped wooden panelling into the room, I could feel long fine threads of silken cobwebs brushing against my face like ghostly fingers that stuck to my skin. I suddenly heard a scuffling, rather strange noise. A young girl, not much older than myself, was standing up in the room in her sleeping bag, looking at me in horror, with large brown eyes filled with terror. "Who are you?" she trembled. "My name is Emma. And yours?" The girl's eyes darted over me warily. "My name is Gemma," she said. "That's funny," I said. "You're almost Emma like me, only you have a G in front of your name." "What are you doing here?" she asked me. "You frightened me half to death." "The nights in this house are a hell of a scary, you know. I hear strange things outside, peculiar howls and screams coming from the woods. There's definitely something out there at night. I heard something walking around the house, sniffing and grunting. I have no idea what it was." "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to alarm you or scare you." I threw my backpack onto the floor. "I'm running away from home," I said. "And you?" "Same," she said, visibly relaxing. "I'm running away too. Actually, I'm glad you've come. I could do with the company. It gets lonely here." "You don't happen to have any food on you?" she asked. "I'm half starved." "As it happens, I do," I said. The girl looked absolutely thrilled. Before long I'd lit a couple of candles, and I was sharing my food with Gemma, who was tucking into the slices of bread and peanut butter as if she hadn't eaten for an entire month. "Why are you running away?" I asked her. "I'm running away from a foster home. My foster father has been trying to get familiar with me, if you get my drift. But I lashed out at him, ran away. I refuse to put up with that kind of behaviour. Of course, even if you tell social services about what's going on, they refuse to listen to you. It's like they've got earmuffs on their ears. They don't want to hear what you have to say. My guess is this kind of abuse of minors is far too commonplace, so they brush it under the carpet, pretend it's not there." "That's terrible," I said. "Good on you for having the guts to leave." "Well, I don't know about that," said the girl. "More like desperation than guts. I don't feel I have a choice." "And you? Why did you run away from home?" "Because I overheard my mother at a dinner party telling her friends that I was the one she wished had never been born. That if there was a burning building, I would be the one she was least likely to save. That I'm the disappointment in the family. Then she went out and bought my two sisters dresses, but not me. Oh no, they didn't have my size, which of course was a huge lie. That's ridiculous. You're not even big. You're small like I am. Every shop would stock your size. Well, it's a convenient, pathetic excuse, isn't it, for her not to buy me anything. In a way, it's her way of inadvertently telling me that I'm her least favourite child, without articulating her stinky thoughts into words. That really is a bummer, said Gemma. Even so, I would still prefer to be in your situation than mine. At least having a mother who doesn't like you that much is a hell of a lot better than having an abusive foster father. I realised Gemma was absolutely right. Despite my mother's blatant discrimination and preferential treatment of my two sisters, I still had a home I could go to, with a roof over my head. Whereas if Gemma returned to her foster home, she would be likely to be subject to abuse from her promiscuous father. For the first time in my life, I soon realised I wasn't as badly off as I thought. But even so, I was glad to be away from my mother. Little did I realise that while I camped out at the abandoned house with Gemma, there was pandemonium at my home. My father was frantically worried about my disappearance. My mother significantly less so, but even she was beginning to realise my absence away from home was causing an undue amount of stress among my siblings and my father, all three of whom were visibly distraught about my absence. All my mother's friends were phoning her up, telling her what a special child I was, and they hoped with all their heart that she would find me. Soon my mother was even laying on the tears of self-pity, exclaiming she couldn't believe such a nonsensical thing had happened to our family. Of course the police had been alerted. A search party had been orchestrated to look for me. But it would seem no one could find me anywhere. My parents began to fear the worst, envisaging all kinds of horrifying scenarios. Maybe I'd been abducted, or worse still, was lying dead somewhere. They had not even discovered that I'd taken food, a sleeping bag, or even questioned the fact that I'd disengaged the alarm. Having an alarm in the 80s was rather unusual at the time, but nobody had noticed a thing. It hadn't occurred to them that I'd run away from home. I mean, after all, why would a girl from a highly esteemed Seattle neighbourhood, with two seemingly loving, devoted parents, ever want to leave her home? I stayed in that abandoned home for 3 weeks, closer to 4 actually. It was with my piggy box money that Gemma and I were able to make regular trips to town to pick up groceries, as while everyone was looking for me, it would seem by a cruel twist of fate, no one was actually looking for her. She went around town without anyone batting an eyelid. It would seem a missing foster child in the big scheme of things didn't really carry as much weight as a local missing girl did, for Gemma saw my picture posted all around town. I thought it was ludicrous, as surely all missing children should be equally as significant and valuable as any other missing girl or boy should be. All I can say is that without Gemma's presence, I'm not sure I would have been able to cope with living in the abandoned house for as long as I did. She was as tough as old boots, with a gargantuan courage and a profound steely grit, which rubbed off me in a very positive way. It was hardly surprising that over the next 3 weeks, Gemma and I developed a unique, special bond. I grew to love her as much as my 2 birth sisters, as being caught up in this precarious situation together brought us very close. At night things would get very scary for us. I was ever grateful to the 2 candles that were left burning brightly all night to alleviate the terrible tenebrous darkness. It was on one night we both got particularly terrified. We heard ghostly footsteps walking around the house. They were ponderous, heavy and substantial, as if something of mighty girth and weight was pouncing around outside. Our imagination grew in leaps and bounds as we pondered with great trepidation what it could possibly be. Our fertile imaginations were not kind to us. We then heard grunts and something began to cough. We were certain something or someone was out there, but what, we couldn't imagine. We remained incredibly still. That was when the most terrifying thing happened. The door of the abandoned house creaked wide open on its hinges. A cool, feisty breeze entered the house, along with stray leaves that blew across the wooden floor like celestial butterflies. Gemma and I wiggled in our sleeping bags to the far corner of the room, while the candles flickered on their wicks. To our horror we discerned the silhouette of a tall, powerful creature that was caught in the light of our candles. The creature was shaped like a giant human being, of easily over 7 foot tall, 500 pounds, covered in long flowing hair, with a peculiar pyramid-shaped head that hung low on his humongous shoulders. This thing also had overlong arms and was covered in hair that was the colour of the blackest black. At that moment I was absolutely terrified, huddling up close to Gemma as tightly as I possibly could, not only hearing my heart pounding in my chest violently, but hers as well. I don't think I'd ever been that frightened in all my life. The creature sniffed the air, sounding exactly like a horse does when it breathes through its nasal cavity. It moved gracefully towards us, creaking the floorboards beneath his sizable feet. In the soft, gentle, caressing light of the candles, I could see his eyes very clearly. I don't mind admitting to you that I was too horror-stricken to look at his eyes. I was afraid of what they would convey. For are not eyes the windows of the soul? Often eyes tell us whether the person in our midst has honourable or dishonourable intentions towards us. Yet for some inexplicable reason, both Gemma and I were drawn towards the creature's eyes. I promise you, in all my born days, as long as I have lived, I have yet to see more beautiful kind eyes than the eyes this anomalous outlandish creature possessed. Everything else about his physical demeanour was intimidating and daunting. The creature was lofty, majestic, and powerful in size, weight, and might. Yet his awesome presence was so impressive. I could feel my rapid heartbeat begin to subside, my breathing begin to relax, as I locked eyes with the creature. In my mind I audibly heard the words, "Are you kids all right? I'm very worried about the both of you." That was when I noticed the creature had 2 dead rabbits in his hands, which he put at our feet. I realized to my amazement that he had brought these rabbits to us for food. The creature pointed at the rabbits and then at us, and in my mind he said, "For you both to eat." As you can imagine, after the extraordinary creature retreated and glided away, closing the door behind him softly and graciously as he left, all Gemma and I could discuss was the creature. We both firmly decided that although he was very much a physical being, he also was angelic. There was something otherworldly, unconditionally loving about him that is impossible to put into words for you. But it felt almost supernatural. We both knew that staying in this abandoned house, we would never be afraid, for whatever that remarkable creature was, he almost certainly had our backs. He was watching over us, that was for sure. We buried the rabbits to avoid offending the creature, but every night he brought us food. On one occasion he even brought us fish, which we would have loved to have cooked, but we didn't have an accessible oven. So again those fish were unfortunately buried. Finally, when we'd run out of money, I persuaded Gemma to come home with me. I had decided that by returning home, it wasn't so bad after all, as staying in the abandoned house, starving to death, did not seem like a great idea. When I knocked at the front door of our home, my mother opened it, standing in the doorway, hardly daring to believe that she saw me there. She burst into tears, running up to me, embracing me like she'd never done before, throwing her arms effusively around me, like the prodigal son in the Bible story. "Where have you been? We've been worried to death about you. We thought we'd lost you. We thought we were never going to see you again. I can't tell you how frightened I've been." To cut a long story short, my vanishing off the face of the earth shook my family to its core. I admitted to my family that I'd run away from home because of my mother's favouritism. I exclaimed that I'd heard what she'd said about me at the dinner party. My mother admitted that that was the way she had previously felt about me. But not any more, she assured me. "When you were gone, and I thought you were dead, I thought I'd lost my baby. I thought something had been ripped out of me. I realised that despite everything, I love you, Emma, with all my heart." The very good news is that my parents decided to physically adopt Gemma. She became a much-loved, precious member of our family household. Very soon, even my parents forgot that she was actually adopted and not related to us by blood. All this happened in the 80s, so it was only later on in life that I was to discover the creature that took us under his wing was known as a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, or a Yeti. I want to assure you that this creature had a heart of absolute gold, so don't tar all Bigfoots with the same brush. All these years later, my two sisters are both happily married, but it is Gemma and I whom have both had thriving careers, as well as marriages. Gemma is a highly sought-after author of children's books, and I am a well-known esteemed artist, so it seems that Hercule Poirot, with the Cuban cigar, was right after all. I did turn out to be a star. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was happening again. They could hear the strange sound of heavy, ponderous feet thumping the ground outside the wooden cabin. Thump, thump, thump. Whatever or whoever it was out there on this dark, tenebrous, cold March night was certainly making its baleful, inauspicious presence known. For indeed you were left in no uncertain doubt that something was definitely out there. Whatever it was, it had to be quite substantial in size. The southeasterly wind was howling through the trees, the boughs jiggling and shaking against the feisty assault, causing anything flimsy in its wake to either snap off, break, rock, or bump rather precariously. Ostensibly, the rather dodgy window in the cabin's kitchen had almost certainly seen better days. It obviously needed replacement by the maintenance staff on the campground and had clearly been overlooked, as it was rattling continuously as the mighty wind roared. Whatever was outside the cabin right now made a distinguishable, isolated sound that was not acquainted to the wind whatsoever. Indeed, the two young girls could almost certainly discern the difference. They could hear the creature crunching the white pebbles beneath its feet that surrounded the cabin in a neat square that was now strewn with a light veil of snow. The ground heaved, groaned, wobbled and shook as the creature outside, whatever in God's name it was, moved around. Even the solid wooden floors of the cabin, that by all accounts seemed rather sturdy, almost seemed to rock and sway precariously, much like a large boat out at sea, desperately trying to stay afloat against the choppy, tempestuous, turbulent waters. The noise was scaring Brie and her friend Nicky half to death. They clung together tightly, holding on to one another for dear life, like two unsteady, inebriated drunks, buttressing each other up for support, rather like the strings in a mattress. Nicky's hand was squeezing Brie's arm ever so tightly that Brie would soon discover a whole line of bruises were about to form down her arms. The young 19-year-old girls' hearts pounded in their chests. The fear coursed through their veins. It was happening all over again, like it did every night. Nicky's earnest brown eyes grew wide with terror. Her body began to shake like a blancmange jelly. "Who is out there?" she cried in dismay. "What are they? More to the point, what do they want?" The young girls had decided that the footsteps were not from the campground manager, for no normal human being walked like that. The girls knew that they were trespassing on private land. The campground had closed for the season. The two young girls were squatters looking for a roof over their heads. The empty cabin had seemed the perfect spot. They both had waitressing jobs in Manhattan, but couldn't afford to rent out an apartment, nor did they fancy dossing down in a homeless shelter for the night. They continued to hear the rather perturbing, anomalous footsteps walking around the cabin, stopping from time to time. They were certain they could hear whatever it was, exhaling a long drawn-out breath that sounded like a large sigh. Then it began to just walk away. Brie ran stealthily to the window, twitching back the red velvety curtain, to see if she could see anything from the window. She thought she could see the figure of a tall, dark silhouette, disappearing into the trees that fringed the cabin from 50 feet away. Whatever it was, she told her friend, it had thankfully gone. The two girls hugged each other tightly, as relief flooded over them. "What the hell is it?" said Nicky. "I have no idea," said Brie, throwing some more wood onto the fireplace to keep the fire going, as it was their only vital source of warmth. It would be the only thing that would give the young girls away, if anyone discerned the smoke rising out of the chimney. Both the girls had moved two of the settees towards the hearth to use as makeshift beds for their sleeping bags, as they were desperate to keep as warm as they possibly could, for the temperatures in the cabin were freezing cold. The cabin had no available amenities, as there was no hot water, electricity, or latrine facilities available,
as the cabins had all been disconnected to the main power supply over the winter. So Bree and her friend Nikki had both found a spot behind a large red oak tree to relieve themselves, should the need arise. Bree had been careful to park her truck further away from the cabin, so as to avoid drawing any attention to their presence on the vacant campground. She had surreptitiously covered it with twigs and bracken to avoid it being discerned or detected, just in case any of the owners or employees were wandering around the campground in March. But chance would be a fine thing. They needed the truck to get to their waitressing job, as the cabin was in a rural area 20 minutes outside New York. Bree came from a wealthy, affluent family who lived in the highly esteemed upmarket Tribeca neighborhood, but her acrimonious, uncompromising father had put a rigorous, profound pressure on her to get a law degree and go to Harvard. It would seem most people would have gladly grabbed such an amazing opportunity with both hands, but not Bree. She had no desire to become an accomplished, efficacious lawyer, so she had put her foot down firmly, standing up to her father with a very big no. Bree's father, Harper Weber, was not used to anyone saying no to him, or standing up to him as defiantly as his refractory, stubborn and headstrong daughter had done. There was a small part of Harper Weber that secretly marvelled and was rather impressed by his muleless teenage daughter's steely grit and obstinacy that she had clearly inherited from him, while another part of him was disgruntled and very peeved that his contrary, obstreperous daughter was rebelliously declining a law degree at Harvard. I mean, who does that? He couldn't for the life of him understand his daughter's enigmatic proclivity towards the world of art. In his humble opinion, pursuing a capricious creative path was indeed a slippery slope, an outlet for those that were not as clever, or for gay men who wanted to get into interior design, graphics, or become restaurateurs. He didn't feel that this vacillating, erroneous world was one he would like his daughter to embark upon. Bree had literally begged her father to send her to arts college, as she had a fervent passion for all things creative. But her old-school traditional father believed that pursuing a creative path was not going to make her amount to much in life, which Bree thought was ridiculous and nonsensical. "Well, if you won't pay for me to go to arts college, I'll find a way to do it myself," she said to her father. At that revelation her father had smirked at her. "I'd like to see you try, Bree. You'll come back home in 2 minutes begging me to send you to Harvard. You'll never be able to financially support yourself." Bree could be as bull-headed and stubborn as her father was. She was determined to show him that she didn't need his financial support. She could make her own way in the world without his help. In truth, it had been harder than she could have ever envisaged, and far from making money to go to arts college, she was barely making enough money to pay her food bills, let alone her petrol. And as for finding an affordable roof over her head, that was pretty much close to impossible. Bree had blatantly lied to both her parents, informing them proudly that she was renting an apartment, had found an online job selling fashionable clothes. Very soon she would have saved enough money to enroll in arts college, she assured them. She had discerned the audible shock in her father's voice. It was very apparent that he had never believed she was capable of making it on her own. She would show him that it certainly could be done. In truth, she felt exactly like a shipwreck. There had been times when she'd been reduced to eating cold-baked beans out of a tin. For the first time in her life, Bree had tasted the world of the disadvantaged. But hell would freeze over first before she asked for a penny from her father or admitted that she was in trouble. Nikki's story was somewhat different. She came from a low-income family, where her mother had raised over 8 children, while their father had absconded, starting a new life with a woman who didn't want to have any babies. Nikki's father could not cope with the demands of a big family. He found raising kids to be a huge headache, which he couldn't handle. It had all got too much for him, a household full of screaming, demanding children. He had left home for a while to take a break, but had never returned. He sent her divorce papers in the post. None of the children had ever seen their father since then, while her mother had to rely on the state to cover the living costs for her family. She had tried to claim child support from her ex-husband, but he had this remarkable habit of elusively disappearing off the radar when you were trying to locate his fixed address. So she had given up pursuing the man, putting him down as a complete, total and utter loser. Even though Bree had been to posh private schools all her life and had holidays abroad in exotic locations and gone skiing in Aspen from time to time, Nikki had stayed in New York at the family apartment at Flushing in Queens in the northeast Bronx area. Her mother had recently given birth to yet another kid and was pregnant again, while her new boyfriend had since moved into their apartment. For Nikki, returning home for her was a physical impossibility, as the household was bursting at the seams. "I don't know why my mother didn't have her tubes tied a long time ago," she had complained to Bree. "She only has to look at a man and she falls pregnant. I've spent my life living on hand-me-downs from my two older sisters and stuff bought at the thrift store. Life would have been a lot easier for us if my mother hadn't had so many kids in the first place. Now, don't get me wrong, I really do love and adore my brothers and sisters, but let's just say life can get very tough when there's so many hungry mouths to feed." It would seem that two unlikely girls from two completely different walks of life had become firm friends. It had been tough going staying in the freezing cold cabin, but at least it had been a roof over their heads. And as Bree had poignantly pointed out, beggars can't be choosers. Bree was very glad to have her friend Nikki for company. The two of them pooled their money together to cover their costs, and Bree could not imagine how lonely she would feel without Nikki's bright, flamboyant, upbeat personality. Even better, Nikki knew all about embracing hard times. She had a few tricks up her sleeve to make their money last longer. Tonight, Bree and Nikki were going to Bree's Tribeca home to have dinner with her parents, so they had both purchased dresses from an apartment store they were going to wear for the evening. Then they would return them the following day, as there was no way they could possibly afford to keep those dresses. It was important for Bree to give her father the impression that she was financially independent and doing incredibly well, thank you very much. So arriving for lunch dressed to the nines and looking successful was exceedingly important to her. Both girls had managed to slip into the gym, using the bathroom facilities there. Bree could not remember the last time she'd enjoyed a shower so warm, the water cascading over her body, offering her so much pleasure. By the time the two young girls had done themselves up, they looked as if they'd both stepped out of bandboxes. No one could imagine how bad their living conditions really were. "You look $1 million, said Nikki. "So do you," said Bree. "The main objective is to look as if we're financially prosperous in front of my parents." The dinner with Bree's parents, by all accounts, had gone remarkably well. They lived in a fabulously wealthy multi-million-dollar 26-foot-wide mansion on 7 floors in the heart of Tribeca, with rooms that possessed 24-foot ceilings, designed by the renowned architect Philip Couther. They were about 5 bedrooms and 7 bathrooms, and huge outdoor patio areas overlooking the street, fabulously decorated with outdoor furnishings and pot plants. When Nikki had seen the kind of lifestyle Bree had left behind, she was utterly astonished. Surely getting a law degree at Harvard to appease her father was infinitely more preferable than living in their current shabby conditions, she thought. Bree's father, Harper Weber, was a very distinguished-looking gentleman, someone that you would know just by glancing at was a mover and shaker in society. He demanded respect wherever he went. His portly stomach hung over his waistband, giving away the fact that he'd clearly overindulged in one too many business lunches. Nikki liked Bree's father at once. He was a charming gentleman, she thought, but she did discern that there was a formidable side to this effusive man, whom she reckoned could be a tough negotiator. "I love your home," she told Bree's mother. "It's so beautiful." Bree's mother was a warm, friendly woman, very well dressed in tailored pants and a loose cotton shirt, obviously designer, probably purchased in one of Tribeca's illustrious boutiques. She looked as if her hair and nails had been done to perfection by a very good hairdresser. She kissed both the young girls warmly on both sides of the cheek, welcoming them into the house. The dinner was absolutely delicious, as the family cook produced a phenomenal 3 to 4 course meal for 2 hungry girls. For starters, it was deep-fried camembert with cranberry sauce. Then there was a light chicken consommé, followed by a beef Wellington with Duchess potatoes and mixed roasted vegetables, and that was then followed by Bree's absolute favourite dessert, creme brulee with raspberries. Finally, the meal had ended with a generous cheese board, chocolate truffles and filtered coffees. Of course, Bree had sagaciously warned her friend to eat very slowly, so that they would not give away their permanent state of hunger. You must leave some leftovers on your plate. We must exude the distinct impression that we're both doing fabulously well, as pulling the wool over my dad's eyes is never easy. So I take it the two of you girls work together on this online business of yours? Bree's father had asked. Yes, said Bree. We're selling designer clothes. Very nice, said her father. I must say you have surprised me immensely, Bree. I never envisaged you would make it on your own, but it seems I have been proved wrong. I'm not used to being wrong, you know, he said, wiping the crumbs away that had gathered on his moustache. I'm very proud of my daughter, he told Nicky. She's raising money to go to art college. I must say I am rather disappointed. I would have loved my daughter to go to Harvard to do a law degree, but it seems like that is not going to happen. Well, I think that's crazy, said Nicky. Why would you want to send your daughter to Harvard? It's overrated, you know. That's what I've heard anyway. Besides, if your daughter doesn't want to become a lawyer, if she acquired a degree, nothing is going to change it, is it? I mean, she still won't want to practice law. So in effect, you'll be throwing your money away. People like to follow their passions in life. An art degree can take you places, you know. You can become a famous photographer, graphic designer, artist, sculptor. There's no end of options available with a career in the arts, which could potentially be quite lucrative, possibly more so than even a law degree would be. You make a very interesting point, young lady, said Harper. I never looked at it like that before. You've certainly given me food for thought. The two girls reluctantly climbed back into the truck to make the rather sombre journey back to the desolate campground after spending a very pleasant, pleasing day with Bree's parents at their lavish, well-appointed upmarket Tribeca home. I think your father's lovely, said Nicky. Yes, granted, he is as stubborn as a mule. I'll give you that, but I'm of the resolute opinion that he can easily be persuaded and prevailed upon to send you to Arts College, to pay for your fees. Don't say that, said Bree, groaning. You'll get my hopes up. I just can't believe how posh and privileged your lifestyle was, said Nicky. Your house is like an opulent swank palace. It's really beautiful. I feel positively depressed about returning back to our freezing cold cabin, along with our rather dismal cold tins of baked beans for sustenance. It seems so bleak and miserable, does it not? The two girls returned to the umbra of the uncongenial wooden cabin. It was cloaked in a velvety caliginosity, the ground covered with a thin layer of recently fallen snow. The tenebrous night offering a scant light from a somewhat obscured gloomy half-moon, along with a faint scattering of ambiguous silvery stars, shrouded by a nebulous smoky mist that seemed to rise up between the trees like a cloudy, white, steamy vapour. That night they both huddled close to the fire in their sleeping bags, while Bree poked at the fire to get it going again, as its smoky embers seemed to be dying. Imagine if my parents knew where we were living. They would have a heart attack. My father would be utterly mortified. My mother's heart would quite literally break. She'd be so upset. It's a good thing they don't examine my life with a fine tooth comb. Luckily they're too busy for all that. Well, at least you've had an education on how the other half live, said Nicky. Not an experience many rich kids like yourself have ever been privy to. Well, I'd rather not know, said Bree. What do they say? Ignorance is bliss. Nicky lit the propane lantern, so that the Cremerian shade of the living room was basked in a generous light. It took the edge off the darkness, making the cabin almost appear cosy. Then it transpired all over again. They could hear the same footsteps patrolling around the cabin, like a centurion on guard duty. It was all exceedingly bizarre. They could hear the distinctive thump, thump, thump once again. The stiff, hardened floorboards of the cabin began to wobble, even though they were so solidly built. I mean, how did that happen? Whatever was out there had to be gargantuan. That was when Nicky saw a dusky figure standing outside the living room window. The curtain had not been drawn this evening. She could see the distinctive face peering in at them through the window pane, smudging its large, flat, aquatic nose against the glass, while the deep-set, dark, treacle-coloured eyes gave off an intimidating, menacing red eye-shine. There was no way a normal human being could peer into a window 8 feet off the ground, she thought. She could see the large, inscrutable black face that took up the entire window pane. Then she saw the creature turn around and leave. But what was it? Bree's heart was thundering in her chest at 100 miles an hour. Indeed, it was thumping so fast, like a frenzied rabbit dashing into a burrow being chased by a fox. For that was when she put her hand on her chest to feel the frantic beats, while her forehead had broken out into beads of perspiration. "Did you see it?" Bree asked Nicky. "See what?" asked Nicky, who was currently lying in her sleeping bag with her eyelids shut, trying to sleep. "The face at the window, looking in at us." "No, I didn't see anything." "I think it was a Bigfoot," said Bree excitedly. "In our part of the world? Please," said Nicky. "Surely not. This is New York, girl, not West Virginia." "Well, this is a rural area outside of New York. Why would a Bigfoot not live here? There are deer in the woods, a large lake, food and water sources available for it." "Oh, go to sleep, Bree," said Nicky, emitting a loud yawn. "Your imagination is running wild. You're seeing things that aren't there. I'm trying desperately to get some sleep after an afternoon spent with your parents and all that yummy food. I'm absolutely exhausted." Bree was on tenterhooks. She couldn't get to sleep. She had become agitated, restless, like a cat on a hot tin roof, after seeing a creature she thought might just be a Bigfoot. In fact, she was almost sure of it. Her curiosity was getting the better of her. If by any chance this creature was indeed a Bigfoot, then Bree wanted to get a closer look at it. She knew Nicky would put up a strong opposing resistance, almost certainly stopping her from going outdoors, so she waited until she could hear Nicky snoring. Then she threw on her jeans, a sweatshirt, anorak, woolly hat, gloves and boots, and placed a headlamp on her head. She surreptitiously ventured out of doors as quietly as she could, so as not to disturb her sleeping friend. She opened the door. The gusts of wind were so strong she only just missed stopping the door from slamming shut loudly on its hinges. She breathed a huge sigh of relief, tiptoeing furtively out of doors, rather like a burglar on the prowl, trying her level best not to crunch the pebbles beneath her feet, which was a fate almost infeasible to accomplish. She shivered with the cold as the icy wind howled through the trees, punnelling her anorak like those aggressive brushes at a car wash. The lion-hearted Bree was not easily put off or daunted by her valiant, indomitable mission. If there was a Bigfoot out there, she wanted to find him. She hit pay dirt as she discovered a long line of fresh footprints in the snow, leading directly from the cabin to the woods. These footprints were enormous, easily 20 inches long. Bree could feel an excited, high-spirited thrill coursing through her veins, similar to the feeling she got when she braved a roller coaster. Even though it was freezing cold, her focus was so unshakably pronounced. She almost forgot about how cold she actually was. The vespers of twilight clasped the night with an inky blackness, devoid of light. But Bree did not care. She could see well enough with her efficient headlamp. The red oaks, the maples, the London plane trees that framed the edges of the wood grove were heavily dusted with snow, but the wind was blowing quite vigorously, causing the boughs of the branches to sway like large, powerful men, oscillating their fists around in a drunken brawl. For the more faint-hearted, cowardly, timorous, or less adventurously inclined, this indeed would have been an ominous expedition that would have been fruitless for most, as they would have been wise enough to return to the safe confines of their home. Bree, however, was no cowering pussycat. She had guts of steel. Much like her father, she was a highly driven character. When she wanted something, she went for it with everything she had. Tonight was no exception. The haunting mist that rose through the trees, like an ethereal ghostly carpet, did very little to discourage her. Soon she was running through the snow. Then she saw him. The tall, dark, solitary figure with overlong, spidery arms that dangled well beyond his knees. His straight, heavily muscular back was turned away from her. He was marching through the trees, swinging his arms backwards and forwards as he moved. Indeed, he was so graceful, so agile. He almost looked like he was floating on air. Bree knew without a shadow of a doubt that this creature was indeed a Bigfoot. She darted cautiously behind one tree to another, rather like a professional hunter ambushing his quarry. She was desperate to get a glimpse of the creature's face. Her heart fluttered through her chest like a sea of butterflies. Her stomach did backflips in her excitement. Despite the extreme cold, she could feel the sweat gathering under her armpits. The 9-foot-tall creature suddenly stopped for a moment, but Bree was hidden behind a tree, hoping with all her heart not to be seen. The creature clearly sensed her presence, for he scanned the woodgrove, his nose sniffing the air, almost as if he could pick up her scent. Bree's heart pounded so loudly in her chest, it sounded like a drum roll. "Please don't see me," she begged in her heart. "Please let me have a good look at you, but please don't see me." The Bigfoot turned around while Bree peeked at him from the corner of a tree stump. She had an excellent view of the creature, even with her headlamp switched off. For a brief moment the mist had cleared. The bright golden light of the ivory moon cast its ethereal soft moonlight shadows over the creature's hair-covered body. She could see the distinctive pyramid-shaped head, the deep-set dark eyes, the inky black hair. The creature continued to walk forward, while Bree surreptitiously followed it. It stood still, tall, proud, majestic, lofty, like a statuesque imposing tree. She discerned that the Bigfoot appeared to be examining something on the ground. He pulled this thing towards him, like a large sack of potatoes. He began to slap at whatever it was, as if he was trying to rouse it. The motionless, unflinching, long vertical form did not appear to be moving. Bree realised that it was a human body, a frozen corpse that was clearly deceased. Had the Bigfoot killed it, she wondered in horror. She wanted to scream out, but she managed to hold her tongue. Now she was gripped by a terrifying, paralysing fear. She turned around, backtracking from whence she had come, hightailing it as fast as she possibly could, back to the cabin, as the adrenaline that coursed through her veins was like a steam train on full throttle. It had begun to snow. The snowflakes fell down from the overcast sky, fast, furious and thick. Bree rushed through the cabin door, slamming it behind her so hard that Nicky jumped up from her sleeping bag, looking at Bree with a somewhat bemused, befuddled expression on her face. She saw Bree standing there in her woolly clothes and anorak, bespeckled by flecks of recently fallen snow, just staring at her with wide-open eyes. "You haven't been out, have you? Out in the snow? You're covered in snowflakes. What the heck is wrong with you? You look as white as a ghost." There's a dead body in the woodgrove. A man, I think. I followed a Bigfoot into the woodgrove. It was dragging the body across the ground. I think it killed the man. What are we going to do? Supposing it comes after us." "You think the Bigfoot killed a man out there?" asked Nicky, looking terrified. "So there really is a Bigfoot out there? You weren't imagining things. You actually saw it?" Bree nodded. "I told you I thought it was a Bigfoot. It definitely was a Bigfoot. Those creatures are real." Nicky grew alarmed. "Did he see you?" "I don't think so, but it might have heard me running away." Bree began to stab 911 into her cell phone. "We have to let the police know there's a dead body on the campground." "But Bree, we can't let the police find out we're illegally squatting here. They'll ask us all kinds of awkward questions. How will we explain finding a deceased body in the first place at the dead of night? They'll guess we're squatting. We could get into a whole heap of trouble. I'll say we were going for a late-night stroll. I drove through the campground as I wanted to show you the cabins so that we could book them in summer. We decided to take a light stroll. What's wrong with that? We discovered the dead body. We can't say anything about the Bigfoot, of course. They'll think we're completely loopy. But we must let them know about the deceased man. That could be anyone's loved one who's missing." In a trice, Bree and Nicky quickly threw all their worldly possessions into the back of the truck, tidying up the cabin, brushing away any evidence of the fire in the crate. Then they got into the truck and called the police. Yes, my name is Bree Webber. I'd like to report a dead body at the Misty Hill campground, in the woodgrove there. It's a dead man. Yes, that's right. No, I think he has frozen, but I'm not sure as to the manner of his death. No, I don't live in the area myself. I'm from the Tribeca neighbourhood. I'm at the Misty Hill campground now. That's right. Yes, I know it's not open. It's off-season. But I was just showing my friend around in the dark. I know the owners, you see. I know they wouldn't mind me showing my friend around. We're thinking of hiring one of the cabins in the summer. Yes. Thank you. No, I'll be here. I'm in a white SUV. I'll be waiting for you. Yes, the name's Bree Webber. There we go, said Bree, switching off her cell phone. How did I sound? Convincing, I think. But these are police we're talking about. They're good at picking up lies and fabricated stories. I hope to God they're not going to interrogate us. But what about? About the fact that you found the dead body, silly, in the woodgrove. That could make us a potential suspect. Well, at least you. About the fact that you were the one that found the deceased body. That makes you a potential suspect. Always the person who discovers a deceased body is often under suspicion. So now she tells me. I'm only looking at worst-case scenario, Bree. Very soon the campground was flooded with blue lights flashing, police vehicles everywhere. One of the police officers came and tapped on the SUV. Are you the one that called in 911, Bree Webber? That's right, officer. It was me, Bree Webber. I was the one that called in. Do you mind taking us, Bree, to where you found the deceased body? Of course not, said Bree, climbing out of the SUV, glad to be of help. She led the 3 policemen through the woodgrove with her. She was pleased to note that the trail of Bigfoot prints had been covered by a carpet of recently fallen snow. It's over there, she said, pointing to the vertical form, buried beneath a thick layer of freshly fallen snow. The ground beneath him was dappled in pink, which Bree assumed was blood. You could make out the red of the man's anorak and his beige pants, but the man looked rather like a frozen leg of lamb you'd take out of the freezer to defrost. The policeman ran over to examine the corpse of the dead man, taking care not to touch the body. He began to speak on his walkie-talkie. Yes, it's a deceased body. Been dead for approximately 24 hours, possibly more, I would say. Yes, well nourished, in his early 60s. We need to call the coroner. It looks like the man was killed with multiple gunshot wounds. There's blood all over the snow, but it's not a lot. It looks like overkill. Definitely personal, my thoughts exactly. Someone close to the victim, I imagine. But I'm not sure they were killed here. Not enough blood around the body. Bree was astonished. Gunshot, she thought. The Bigfoot I saw could not have killed the man. Bigfoots don't use guns. Yet she'd seen the creature pulling the body. Maybe he'd been examining it, she thought, feeling guilty of falsely accusing the creature of murder. So someone else had killed the man. But the question was who and why. Do you need to talk to us, Bree asked the police officer. I mean, I only saw the body, but I know nothing else about it. We never heard gunshots ourselves, nor did we see any strange, suspicious man loitering around the place. So there's really not much else we can tell you. Well, give us your details, said the police officer, so we can keep in touch with you. I'm waiting for the coroner. The area will be covered in crime scene shape shortly. It looks like this case is not going to be that difficult to solve. We need to find the person who has a huge grudge against this man. Then we're more than likely to find our killer. You never shoot a body dozens of times over, long after they're dead, in my professional experience, unless you have an axe to grind with someone. My guess is he made someone very, very upset. Who is he? Asked Bree. No idea, said the officer. We're going to have to take his fingerprints, run them through our Federal Bureau of Investigation automated fingerprint system to see if we get a likely match. We'll possibly have an answer to your question shortly. I don't think he's a vagrant. You can see he's remarkably well dressed, decent-looking clothing, well-groomed, shaved, even though your hair does grow after death. He doesn't look unkempt. Well, what was he doing out here? On an empty campground of all things, asked Bree. Maybe he wasn't killed here. He could have been dumped here. With the campground closed for the season, the killer possibly thought that his body would have been eaten up by wild animals, which is more than likely when there are lots of hungry animals in the cold weather, before anyone is able to identify him. What he didn't realize is that there are other ways to identify a corpse, even if you find a few scattered human remains. We have a useful thing called DNA. And then there's dental analysis. Bree joined Nikki in the truck. They drove to her parents' home in Tribeca, as Bree decided sleeping in the car was not the best option for them that night, while returning back to the cabin was out of the question now with the police all sniffing around. "What are you going to say to your parents?" Nikki asked. "It's about 2 o'clock in the morning. Aren't your parents going to freak out with us arriving at their house so early?" "Watch and learn," said Bree, winking at Nikki. "I'll show you how we'll get a comfy bed for the night, without my parents suspecting a thing. Where there's a will, there's a way. You just have to be creative, and let's just say I have oodles of creativity in me." Bree parked her truck on the outside pavement on the tree-lined street. It was deathly quiet. The street was now covered in snow. They knocked on the door and could hear footsteps racing down the staircase, someone fumbling with a lock. "Dad, it's only me," called Bree. Her father opened the door to the two girls. He was wearing a dark navy and cobalt blue striped dressing gown. He looked as if he was half asleep. "Do you girls realise what time it is in the morning? Is everything all right? What are you doing here? I thought we got rid of you this afternoon." Bree wrinkled up her nose. "Our apartment's been fumigated, Dad, for an infestation of roaches. We couldn't breathe in there. It was so stuffy. I was getting a thumping headache, so I decided to come home if you don't mind. We can't sleep with all that chemical stuff in the air. They said it was safe for us to return, but I'm struggling to breathe in there." "Did you not know it's not healthy to stay indoors once a property has been fumigated?" "I don't like the sound of that headache of yours," said her father, ushering Nikki and Bree indoors. "We have 4 extra bedrooms in this house, so you girls take your pick. Right now I'm going straight back to bed. You caught me in the middle of one of my great dreams. I need to get right back to continue where I left off," he said. "Help yourselves to anything you need." And with that he tottered up the staircase, making eager tracks to his bedroom. "See, I told you," whispered Bree. "Comfortable, warm beds for the night, at your service." "This is such a pleasant, delightful surprise," said Mrs. Webber, when Bree and Nikki joined her for croissants and fresh orange juice on the patio the following morning. "Oh, I'm thrilled to have you both staying over here for a change. Bree, I feel as if we haven't seen you for ages, with your being so busy with that online business of yours," she said, sipping her coffee. "You know, Nikki, my daughter is as stubborn as her father. The two of them are like 2 peas in a pod. Harper wanted Bree to go to Harvard, but as I kept telling him, that boat has already long since sailed. I mean, Bree, you look absolutely exhausted these days. I've noticed the dark circles under your eyes. You can tell me to stop interfering, but it seems to me you're burning the candle at both ends, working way too hard with your online fashion business to raise the cash for Arts College, just to make a point to your father. I mean, really, heaven knows what that apartment of yours is like if you had to get it fumigated. What sort of place is infested with roaches? Sounds like the place you're staying at is not very desirable. I think your father should pay for Arts College and be done with it. The way I see it is there's no point in Harper persuading you to do law. It ain't going to happen. He needs to get over it." "What's not going to happen?" asked Harper, joining the 3 women for breakfast, helping himself to a croissant and some coffee. "I was just saying, dear, that you and Bree are like 2 peas in a pod, as stubborn as hell. You wanted Bree to go to Harvard to do law, didn't you? But she wanted to go to Arts College. She's raising the money to go there, just to make a point to you. But look at her, darling. Look at those dark circles under your poor daughter's eyes. What about this apartment she's staying at that needs fumigating? I dread to imagine what the place looks like. I think, Harper, you and Bree should call a truce. You should agree to pay for her to go to Arts College. Forget about Harvard. It's all pie in the sky now." "You don't need to convince me about that. If you must know, Nikki over here persuaded me at dinner that sometimes a career in fine arts can be very lucrative indeed. It's not as fickle as I thought it was. I've been doing some research on the matter. I find she's absolutely right. So I'm going to pay for you to go to Arts College, Bree, so you can give up your online business." Bree tried not to look ecstatic. She maintained a fixed expression on her face. "No, it's fine, Daddy. I'll raise the money myself. I told you I would." Don't look a gift horse in the mouth, said Nicky, giving Bree a nudge. I'm sure she'll accept your kind offer, Mr. Webber. Thanks, Dad, said Bree. Nicky's right. I would be foolish not to accept your offer. The truth is my online business is rather draining me. I'm worn to a frazzle. Good. That's settled, said Mrs. Webber, looking pleased. Also, girls, I would prefer you to stay here. I'm concerned about that apartment of yours with all the fumigation. You can both stay here for as long as you like. Please phone that landlord of yours. Give him your notice. Tell him you shan't be returning any time soon. Nicky and Bree gave each other happy winks from across the table, heartily relieved that the days of eating cold-baked beans out of a tin and counting pennies and squatting in a cold cabin were well and truly behind them. If you'll excuse me for a moment, said Bree, I just need to make a phone call. Officer Alinsky speaking. How can I help you? Hello, officer. This is Bree Webber speaking. I met you last night. I was the one that called in the dead body that I saw in the Woodgrove at the Misty Hills campground. I'm phoning to find out if you know who the dead man was. Have you managed to catch the perpetrator? Or is it still early days? I'm jumping at the gun, champing at the bit to find out exactly what happened. I must apologise, officer, but I am very inquisitive. Oh, hello, Bree, said the officer, chuckling at the end of the phone. No need to apologise for being curious. You have every right to be in the circumstances. Well, given you found the body, I think you deserve to know what was going on, as without your invaluable phone call, it would be a long time before the next of kin would be informed about their loved one. Yes, we found a match for the fingerprints. They belonged to a man called Lennon Shutterstock. We brought the brother in for questioning. He was very distraught. The moment I got a glimpse of his face, I had an inkling that somehow he was involved in his brother's murder. Being an officer for many long years, you rely on your instincts an awful lot, as well as body language. It's a rather sad, unfortunate fate of affairs, as they often are. Lennon's brother Merlin Shutterstock confessed to the murder, almost at once. He wasn't very good at hiding his guilt. He is very remorseful, poor man. I don't think he really fathomed what he'd done. He reacted very adversely in the heat of the moment, in an impassioned, heated frenzy that got way out of hand, as is often the case. So his own brother killed him? But that's terrible. Why would he do a thing like that? I don't understand. Well, Lennon was having an affair with his brother's wife. When he found out about it, he snapped. Did I not say a body with that many bullets in is a clear sign of someone who has an axe to grind? I think the coroner must have found 24 bullet holes in the body. He was killed on the second bullet, but the brother kept on shooting him long after he was dead. He was so filled with rage. Was he killed at the campground? Asked Bree. I mean, you were saying there wasn't enough blood. Well, not as much as you expected to see given the wounds. No, the brother dumped him there. To cut a long story short, Bree did fulfill her dream. She ended up going to arts college and is now a very successful photographer. Her father gave her friend Nicky a job at his company, where she worked as a secretarial assistant. She was able to lift herself along with her family out of poverty. She now lives with her large family in a decent home in a middle-class neighbourhood in New York. Bree often thinks of the anomalous encounter she had with a Bigfoot. She still feels guilty for assuming the creature was guilty of murder. She has now come to realise that in the rural areas and forested parts of New York, there may well be Bigfoots. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners.
Everyone, welcome to the Hog and Hound Bar, said Rudy Rakinski, the bar manager.
A round-faced man with a blushing face that was so pink it looked like he'd recently got burnt in the sun, which was definitely not the case, for indeed his face was always pink. Behind the scenes, when people talked about him, they would refer to him rather unkindly as Pinkface, which was unfortunate, but the name seemed to stick, as everyone knew exactly who you were talking about. By all accounts, he was a jovial, rather jolly man, with a huge, vibrant sense of humour that equally matched his large, extended belly, that had been acquired from knocking back way too many beers over the years. He had congenial, deep-set bull terrier chocolate brown eyes that twinkled with merriment, and a very amenable disposition, so he was well liked by all the locals. He spoke in a deep voice that definitely commanded respect. "Ladies and gentlemen, can I please have your attention?" The raised voices in the bar became hushed as he began to speak. "I'm delighted to introduce you to Miles Fackerman, who is an acclaimed, venerated, highly praised stand-up comic. We go back a long, long time together, when we were in our 20s, so we have a colourful history behind us. But the less said about that, I think, the better. At the time, I tried my hand at being a stand-up comic for a while, but I hasten to say I wasn't very good. I guess I got the most awful stage fright. My nerves got the better of me. Plus, my jokes were rather lame, insipid and wishy-washy, I think, so I almost certainly got booed off the stage. People were brutally unkind back then. They wouldn't put up with squirming, insecure comics that floundered, blundered, or writhed on their words, like I invariably did. People lost patience then, so I was spurned and spat out, if you like, because I didn't pass the grade. I didn't have the audacious iron stomach for all those knockbacks and rejection, but the plucky, indomitable Miles Fackerman here most certainly did. He was made of far braver, tenacious and resolute stuff than I was. From day one all those years ago, he stood up fearlessly in front of the audience. Everyone loved him. So if anyone can give you a skip to your step tonight, it's no other than the great Miles Fackerman. So I have great pleasure tonight to introduce you to one of Seattle's most loved stand-up comics. He knows how to make you laugh like you've never laughed before. Thank you, everyone, for coming here to the Hog and Hound Bar tonight. If you haven't been here before, you are more than welcome. Our illustrious chef Marco Fontaine has a James Beard Award behind him, so don't hesitate to dine out on our exclusive menu. You will not be disappointed. There's also a 25% discount on all our colourful cocktails. Tonight, all the money we are raising is going to the Seattle Animal Shelter, so we will be exceedingly grateful for any extra donations you make to our little furry friends, of which most people here tonight are very eager to support. Everyone cheered as Miles Fackerman nodded his head. Yay! Yay! The Hog and Hound Bar in Seattle was always busy, but no more so than on this auspicious night, as animal lovers all over the county were bustling enthusiastically to order their drinks, while some people sat at tables surrounded by grandiose, rather sumptuous red velvety gold-striped upholstered chairs. They were eagerly ordering the delectable mouth-watering food from the excellent extensive first-class menu, from which to date there had rarely been any complaints. The special of the day was grilled octopus over squid ink pasta with garlic and tomato sauce, or brown butter risotto with lobster. The sanguine, buoyant mood of the bar was animated, as male and female garrulous chatter was hoisted over the background noises, rather like a huge white sail blowing in a headwind, which is a very lovely feeling indeed. You could hear the clink of glasses, the tinkle of ice swirling around in colourful cocktail martini glasses with their little umbrellas and cocktail sticks strewn with exotic fruits, along with the clicking sound of the jukebox being injected with coins to produce more upbeat music that energised and electrified the already animated, fortified mood in the bar. Some rather inebriated, high-spirited people were gyrating their hips in time to the music, waving their glasses flamboyantly in the air, singing with ecstasy, as all inhibitions had been unleashed, rather like a horse being freed to run wild over the pastures without being shackled to its bitten reins. The bar manager, Rudy, was telling everyone to be quiet as Miles Fackerman began his stand-up comic show. It was difficult to hush an intoxicated, tempestuous crowd, as with 20% off the drinks that night, people had gone wild with their orders, Unless you were teetotal, you were pretty much caught under the infectious allure of those ravishing drinks that created a somewhat raucous frenzy, that rather like a feral wildfire could not be easily tamed or subdued, as most people in the bar were staggering around precariously, as if the scaffolding of their own legs was failing to support their bodies in an upright vertical position. Miss Elisa Lamonte was sitting in the corner oakwood table, with about 20 of the locals that lived within 15 minutes of her farmhouse in a rural, rather remote area outside of Seattle. She had actively encouraged them to come along to the bar in her large minivan. She was exceedingly passionate about supporting the animal shelter. She called herself a canophile, which means very much a dog lover. At one time in her life she'd started a rescue centre for greyhounds. She was an attractive-looking woman in her early 60s, with a very good flawless complexion, a wild thicket of white hair that she tied up in a knot on her head. But most of her hair seemed to have a mind all of its own, was hanging loosely around her face in messy rat's tails that could not be tamed, which was contrary and incongruous with her very ordered Puritan personality. She commonly boasted that the last time she'd actually visited a hairdresser was when she was in her early 20s. It almost certainly showed. She wore a tangle of bright colourful scarves around her neck. Her rather voluptuous Rubenesque body was tightly contained in a black sequenced dress that glittered with thousands of sparkling rhinestone jewels, about 5 sizes too small for her, seemingly holding her jiggly bits together like a tight corset, which made many people secretly wonder if the poor woman could actually breathe. Everyone seemed to be having a marvellously good time, but most people were completely plastered, with the glorious cocktails being so cheap. It was very easy to get caught up in the moment, go extravagantly overboard, indulging beyond the threshold of what may be considered reasonable and safe alcohol levels. Bobby Finnegan and Carter Botting got caught up in a bladdered drunken brawl. 2 of the guests that Alicia had invited to the comedy show. Now they had become the show. Soon the stand-up comic was overshadowed by the 2 inebriated men that were throwing their fists at each other, while everyone was cheering on, almost as if they thought the drunken brawl was all part of the comedy act, which they found hilarious and cleverly done, failing to realise that it actually was a genuine fight. "I'll bloody kill you," said Bobby. "He said my wife was a fat, stupid cow," he told the audience. "Did you hear that? He called my wife a fat, stupid cow. No one calls my wife a fat, stupid cow. No one, do you hear that?" In defiant retaliation, Bobby chided, Your wife looks like a man. Your wife looks exactly like a man. She's got hair on her chin. She's growing a beard." The crowd cheered, teasing Carter Botting. One man piped, "Your wife is growing a beard. That's got to be way worse than being a fat cow." At that, Carter became incensed. He began oscillating his arms around like an angry, indignant octopus, but he kept striking the air, as his coordination was way off the mark. His futile attempts to fight back got the crowd clapping and cheering in delight. Carter's face grew crimson with rage. His rounded hazel eyes looked furious. His jaw was clenched very tightly. "My wife, I'll have you know, my wife is not growing a beard." Then it was his turn to pipe something nasty again. Your wife, she stinks. She smells of chip fat. She smells of ship fat and grease. She smells greasy." "Well, that's 'cause my wife can cook. Yours can't make anything without burning it into a cinder. My missus says your wife is the worst cook in the world, the worst cook. I stuffed the sausages in my pocket that she made. They were as hard as rocks. Inedible! Inedible! You hear that?" "Hear that?" cried one man. "Your wife's cooking stinks. No one wants a wife who can't cook." At that, everyone in the bar cheered, and Carter finally managed to push Bobby on the floor. They were fighting each other like two rabid dogs, with fists hitting the floor with very cloddish manoeuvres. They were clumsy but comical to watch. The applause escalated as people took sides, some shouting for Carter, others for Bobby. "Right, I've had enough," said Alicia, going up to the two men, kicking them with her bright, shiny, black high-heeled court shoes. "Get up, the two of you! Stop this fighting at once! I've had enough of it!" Everyone in the bar shouted, "Stop the fighting! Stop the fighting! Stop the fighting!" But it was more like a chant. Alicia pulled the two men onto their feet, slapping their faces indignantly. "I brought you here tonight to have a great time, to support an animal charity. But look how you've let me down. You've brought shame on our whole group. Instead of looking like upstanding American citizens, we look like a bunch of loutish thugs or hooligans. Honestly, when are the two of you ever going to grow up?" Indeed, Alicia was so enraged, hot under the collar, she informed the rest of the group that they were going at once. They were leaving now, ASAP. Most of her group were 3 sheets to the wind, tiddly, gin-soaked, completely trolleyed. They were giggling at everything, finding the most minuscule, absurd, rather mundane, commonplace things terribly amusing, like the scarves that Alicia was wearing, that one of the drunk ladies described as upmarket dish rags, which everybody found terribly funny, with the exception, of course, of Alicia, who was far from amused. The group was promptly escorted by Alicia out of the bar, while everyone cheered, as if they were praising a comedy show. "That was the best comedy performance ever," came one man's voice. "It was bloody brilliant, even if I say so myself. You rarely had us fooled." Everyone clapped, nodding their heads in agreement. Best comedy act ever, they all agreed. Alicia was thinking privately to herself that the humiliating performance between the two best friends had been anything but a comedy show. But if that is what the audience of the Hog and Hound customers thought it was, all well and good. In truth, when Bobby and Carter got into a drunken altercation, it could be terribly funny to watch, although when things went too far, they often got out of hand. On one occasion, Bobby had ended up in accident and emergency with a broken nose, a dislocated jaw, 4 missing teeth. Surprise, surprise, what had the fight been over? Their wives, of course. I mean, what else would it possibly be? Having a dig at each other's wives was too close for comfort. It was always personal, a bone of contention for both men. It would rile them up considerably, causing them to lash out at each other. It was as if a snipe at their wives was a personal attack on them. They immediately would leap to their wives' defence. Normally the two men were the very best of friends, but throw a few drinks their way, invariably the knives would come out, the forked snake-like tongue spitting out derogatory words, the deadly venomous rattles of some misplaced punches that left both men on many occasions ever so slightly beaten up, with, of course, the occasional trip to accident and emergency. But did these two men ever learn from their catastrophic mistakes or incredulous blunders when faced with their sobriety? Absolutely not. Of course they would go through the motions of apologising profusely afterwards to each other, confessing that every nasty word that came out of their mouths was just the drink speaking, nothing else. But in secret, in the cold, hard, cruel light of day, the two men would secretly ponder if many words spoken in jest had a ring of truth to them. Carter would wonder if Bobby had really stuffed his wife's sausages in his pocket, and Bobby would wonder if his wife did smell of chip fat. "It's such a bummer," said Mrs. Landon, giggling uncontrollably, as she sat at a seat next to her husband in the minivan, wrapping the safety belt around her petite form. The normally dignified, aloof woman had allowed her inhibitions to wither away this evening, as she, like many of the others in the group, had drunk far too much. I was really enjoying myself this evening," she told her husband, "until Carter and Bobby got into a drunken brawl together. They completely spoiled the evening for the rest of us. But everyone at the bar thought it was part of the comedy act. They just lapped it up. They loved it. But I knew it was a joke." "Well, we did have an exceedingly good dinner, didn't we?" her husband reminded his wife, taking her hand encouragingly in his, giving it a tight, affectionate squeeze. "Let's not kid. That octopus with the black noodles was delicious. I can't say I'm remotely surprised that the chef has got a James Beard Award." "Is everyone here?" asked Alicia, whom in her younger days had been a school headmistress for an upmarket girls' school in Seattle. But she involuntarily acted as if she was still one, as once you're used to ordering people around, it can become ingrained in your psyche, and Alicia loved nothing better than putting people firmly in their place, lecturing them about how things should be done. At the junior high school where she'd been headmistress, she had a formidable reputation, known as the Woman of Iron. "Is everyone here?" she said, calling out the name she had written on her list. "Just say present if you are." No one seemed to mind Alicia's bossiness, as going out for a drink on the town without worrying about driving was a huge bonus for the 60-year-olds, whom had been invited to the bar this evening in order to support the animal charity. The best thing of all about Alicia was she never drank a single thing. For her, losing control was like a deadly sin. But to her friends, Alicia's sobriety was a huge advantage when it came to receiving a safe lift home. "Right, Bobby," said Alicia, "you're sitting here in the front with me. I don't want you and Carter getting into another altercation together. I've had about as much as I can take of the two of you." "Right, is everybody ready?" she said. "Please put your safety belts on. We're going now." Alicia put on some trendy upbeat music. The minivan started up. She pressed down the accelerator pedal, sailing through the bright twinkling lights of Seattle. By all accounts, it was a quiet Friday night, late in the evening. There weren't many cars on the road, although there were a few slosh-looking people on the streets, staggering back to their downtown apartments. Everyone in the minivan began to sing to the music happily. Alicia groaned to herself, swearing that next time there was a charity occasion at the bar, she would not be inviting Bobby and Carter along for the ride. Those two, whenever they were stoned, got completely out of control. She found herself thinking of the two men, rather like former pupils at her school in her heyday, when she was a headmistress. She had been a great draconian disciplinarian in those days. How she wished she could place those two men under detention. Pity they were way too old for that, she thought. Alicia privately thought to herself that she would invariably take some of the back rural roads. She knew a quicker way back to her rustic farmhouse. She had never attempted this journey before at night, and was oblivious to how challenging it would actually be. She hadn't bargained for the fact that everything would look so unfamiliar and alien to her when there were no street lights on, for what seemed easy to navigate during the light of day was like a befuddling obstacle course at night. Indeed, with only the lights of her minivan, as well as a somewhat obscure full moon, complemented by a tenebrous night, that was almost impossible to see where she was actually going. Of course, being on rough roads not lined with asphalt meant that her van jolted and jiggled all the way, her well-worn rubber tyres spraying up large volumes of dust and tiny pebbles that kept tinkling against the aluminium carcass of her van. For Alicia, the landscape all looked exactly the same. She began to privately worry that she might be getting hopelessly lost, but that was not something she was willing to divulge with any of her friends in the minivan, who were blindly oblivious and too half-cut to really even care, which in itself was a monumental blessing. In their sobriety, her friends would have lost patience with her tonight. Alicia was an exceedingly proud woman, who fancied herself as always being in control, the kind of person you would take with you to a remote desert island, as she would hold it together so tightly, remain as cool as a cucumber in precarious situations, slow to lose her nerves or get flustered, and tonight was no different. Everywhere she looked there were dense silhouettes of tall, statuesque trees, namely ponderosa pines and Douglas firs, clustered together in congenial groups under a dark, inky sky. Although at night the trees did not look congenial at all, as the slight wind that was blowing through the needled boughs caused them to sway in such a way it was almost as if the trees themselves were shaking their heads at her in a gesture of extreme displeasure, whispering to her that she wasn't welcome in these parts. Alicia shivered in trepidation, wishing she hadn't taken a shortcut home, but had chosen to take a straightforward road back to her home, where everyone would be staying overnight in her large farmhouse that boasted over 8 bedrooms. Her guests' trucks were parked in the parking bay at her farmhouse. In the morning they would drive back to their homes once the alcohol had gone through their system, She had in mind to prepare a fabulous breakfast for all her guests in the morning. Bacon, eggs, sausages, mushrooms, tomatoes and toast, served with fresh orange juice and tea. She could hear her guests singing in the back of her van, in an intoxicated state, while some had fallen fast asleep and were out for the count. She was beginning to realize she was driving around in circles, retracing her steps over and over again, taking all the wrong turnings in the road. Those were the days when the privilege of GPS and cell phones were a long way in the future, as this was 1985. Suddenly Alicia realized her van had run out of petrol. She had overlooked filling up the tank, falsely assuming she had enough petrol to get everyone back safely to her property. But driving around in circles for over an extra hour or two had almost certainly drained her tank. The van came to a sudden stop, refusing to move forward or budge even an extra inch. Why had the truck stopped? "What is the problem, Alicia? Why has the truck suddenly stopped?" asked Mr. Landon. He was unclasping his safety belt, moving through the sea of sleeping bodies, towards the front of the minivan. He was the only man that could drink like a fish and remain sober. Alicia's face grew crimson with embarrassment. She felt incredibly humiliated. "I didn't realise I didn't have enough petrol in the tank," she whispered. "The truth is, Alec, I'm awfully lost. I don't know where the hell I am. It's so dark out there. Everything looks exactly the same. I thought I was going to take a shortcut, but I've been driving around and around in circles. I don't know where the heck I am." "Never you mind," said Alec, detecting the rising level of anxiety in Alicia's voice. Something he had never been privy to before, as the woman had nerves of steel, the hide of a rhino. "This can easily happen. The back roads here can be very, very deceptive. I've got lost myself before in the past. Never you mind, Alicia. Everyone is far too plastered to know what's going on. I'll get my wife to keep everyone calm if anyone should wake up. I tell you what, I'll try and find out where we are. I'll walk back to your house. I've got some petrol in the back of my truck. I'll go and get it for you and bring it here." "But do you have a clue where we are?" "No, I don't, but I'll find out. I'm sure I will. It can't be that difficult. I notice you have a torch in the truck. I'll take that. I'm sure I'll find my way back to the house, so don't you worry your pretty face about anything, Alicia." "Are you sure, Alec? That would be such an enormous help. You're such a star. Thank you so much." "What's going on?" came a drunken voice in the back. "Why have we stopped? Has anyone got any more margaritas for me?" "Never you mind," said Felicia. "We've just had a slight problem. Everything's going to be sorted out in a moment." The good news is that the people in the minivan appeared to be too inebriated to pay any attention to what was going on, which was a huge relief. Alec Landon's account. Apart from Alicia, it would seem I was the only one not completely bladdered in the minivan. We had all gone too far at the bar, drinking way too much. Even my wife, Ruth, had not stopped giggling most of the way. It had been years since I'd seen her like this, all because of a 25% discount on the drinks, which no one could resist. I'd never seen my wife ordering so many exotic cocktails before. She was just in her element. She ordered cold-fashioned, which was whiskey with coffee liqueur. Then she ordered firecracker, which was bourbon, with grapefruit juice, port and raspberries. Then she ordered black-eyed rye, which was a sagamore spirit rye, with lime juice, ginger beer, blackberry syrup and mint leaves. And then she ordered some pinhookers, which consisted of pinhook rye, iced tea, lemon syrup, lemon juice and mint leaves. I'm not sure what the others in our group ordered, but let's just say we all went overboard. I was the one that stuck to my craft beers, but was fortunate to be able to handle my drink. Yet even as I climbed out of the minivan with a torch in my hands, I did feel somewhat overwhelmed by the velvety black night, the tall silhouettes of the trees, the stretches of the long dirt road that lay ahead of me. Much like Alicia, despite the fact that I'd driven up and down these roads for over 20 years, I truly couldn't fathom where we actually were. Granted, I was a lot more sober than most, but I hadn't escaped some of the disadvantages of an alcoholic brain. I felt a little foggy and less stable on my feet, which didn't help me at all. I could not for the life of me comprehend why someone as clued up, shrewd and savvy as Alicia could be so ignorant, naive, impetuous and incautious as to risk taking a shortcut in her minivan down some of these rather dicey, dodgy lanes that can be very confusing, rather like a maze, where you can get horribly lost. Everyone in these parts knows this to be a fact. They know it's unheedingly reckless, precipitous, extremely ill-advised to be impulsive and to be daredevil-like in taking shortcuts at night. But then again, the complacent, smug Alicia had always placed herself above the hoi polloi in society, seeing herself as an altogether different breed to the common man, rather like Amelia Earhart, the first female to fly solo across the Atlantic. On many occasions, Alicia had drawn reference to the woman, describing herself in the same context as the esteemed pilot. "I feel like we're both peas in a pod," she would exclaim. "Indeed, if reincarnation is true, I would say without a shadow of a doubt that in my former life I was Amelia Earhart." The truth about this minivan trip is that what should have taken us a mere 20 minutes had taken a couple of hours. I made a note of where Alicia's minivan was parked. I continued to walk down the road heavily strewn with stones, and of course the occasional pothole, which meant on a couple of occasions I tripped and nearly took a big tumble. There was a cool southerly breeze blowing through the tall vertical trees that penciled up into the sky like formidable hostile giants. I say hostile, as the ambience of this bodeful, inauspicious night felt distinctly unfriendly. I was surprised to realise how quiet it actually was. Now let me assure you, when things are very still, the stillness has a distinct sound all of its own, a chilling sound that pierces through your very core like a sharp knife plundering through your chest. It's an uneasy feeling that niggles at you, whispering into your ears like a ghostly ethereal voice, without audible distinguished words, but you can hear them, as every cell of your body is alert, responsive to what you're perceiving in your environment. Without the normal chirping sounds of the crickets or the croaking of the frogs, I was very aware that something was very wrong. My father had always warned me as a young boy that when a place grows ominously quiet, there could potentially be a predator lurking around. It left me with chills meandering down my spine. I sensed that something was watching me. But then was it my imagination being just over-creative? With just my tweed jacket on for protection, I could feel the icy wind biting me with freezing chills that meant I stepped up my speed to keep as warm as I could. I certainly could not have navigated my way down this road without Alicia's torch, so I was ever grateful for small mercies, if there were any on this night. I glanced up at the velvety sky, marvelling at its inky blackness. The moon seemed almost veiled by a misty cloud cover, while the silvery stars, normally so bright and twinkling, looked dim, dull, and inconspicuous. As I trudged down the road, surrounded on either side by hilly grassy embankments, fringed by tall Douglas fir trees, I could hear something was following me. I knew I wasn't mistaken. It sounded like bipedal footsteps, not what you would expect to hear from a mountain lion, but the heavy feet decimated, pulverizing leaves and sticks beneath hardened soles. You could hear the twigs crunching, snapping and popping. Whatever it was plundered the ground with a thunderous footfall that gave me the distinct impression that my stalker had to be ponderous, very substantial in size. I glanced around nervously, my eyes drawn to the trees. I watched for any sign of movement, but I heard and saw nothing. I quickly increased my pace, finding a stick on the ground to use in self-defence. But as I moved, so did this thing that was clearly following me. It sounded as if the ground was groaning every time it picked up speed. When I slowed down, so did it. When I stopped, so did it. And when I increased my speed, so did it. Now I was really feeling frantic. I could feel my hackles rise. My heart was pounding violently in my chest. When I reached the end of the road, where there were two pronounced forks, I didn't know whether to turn left or right. I felt bewildered, very confused. I actually said out loudly, "Damn, where the hell am I? Do I turn left? Do I turn right? What the heck do I do? I decided the left-hand turn looked more familiar. I was about to make the turn when I heard a strange roaring sound that was so discomposing it sent chills racing down my spine. What the hell was that? The daunting noise was more formidable and alarming than a lion's roar, and I say that without a hint of exaggeration. That was when I saw it. It came thundering through the trees at one hell of a mighty speed. When you see something monstrously huge bounding towards you, your first reaction is, no, this can't be real. This is not happening. This must be the drink talking. Everything was so surreal to me that my fear was suspended, almost as if it had been held back for a while, so that I could gain some sense of perspective over what was transpiring. I realized at once that this figment of my imagination was not a spurious creature of fantasy fiction, but a real breathing creature. Then it hit me like a blinding revelation, almost as if you've walked into a dark room, fumbled around in the darkness, but when you reach for the light switch, you know what you're observing. The light reveals it clearly to you. So the thing you thought was a bookshelf, you realized was a bureau. The thing you thought was a couch, you realized was a futon. It was obvious to me that this extraordinary anomalous creature was a Bigfoot. This was hard for me to digest, assimilate or even swallow. Maybe the universe has a sense of humour. I felt as if the Bigfoot was laughing at my nonplussed expression. It was almost as if he sensed how stunned I was to see him. It was almost as if he was saying, "Don't look so bewildered. Get over it. I'm as real as you are." The creature stood up on two legs like a human being, with exactly the same body structure and shape, with a few minor exceptions, the most poignant being the monstrous size of the creature, its muscular strength and tone. It was gargantuan, lofty, majestic, powerful, covered from head to toe with dark hair that appeared darker than the night, as the contrast between the background and the Bigfoot was strikingly pronounced. This very masculine Bigfoot cowered in the light of my torch. He kept covering his eyes with his hands, but I guess I couldn't help just staring at the creature in total astonishment, with a touch of wondrous awe thrown in for good measure. For a long time fear had not entered the equation for me, which I think was a jolly good thing. But when I saw the creature's eyes, I knew at once that I had nothing to worry about. There are no words in the English language to describe the kindness and integrity of those eyes. I knew that he was friendly. I knew that he was trying to help me. I nodded at him and proceeded down the left path of the road. The creature shook his head at me, indicating for me to go to the right. "But," I said to him, "I need to get to Sunnydale Farmhouse." Using my stick, I drew my friend's farmhouse in the sand. The Bigfoot ran up to the drawing, which I lighted up with my torch. I drew Alicia's large symmetrical farmhouse with the two imposing oak trees in the back. The Bigfoot nodded at me. He appeared excited. I realized he knew exactly what I was drawing. He nodded his head profusely, indicating for me to follow him. Once again he was pointing to the right. He ran boldly ahead of me, swivelling his pyramid-shaped head around, rather like an owl's from time to time, to study me through his deep-set honey-coloured eyes that glittered with a red eye-shine in certain lights, to check that I was indeed following him. He glided so smoothly and seamlessly across the ground, at a very fast speed, unhindered by the rocks and potholes in the road. He swung his overlong arms backwards and forwards in time with his 5-foot strides. He moved as if he was floating like a sailboat, bobbing on the water. Unfortunately, I found myself breaking into a run, not to mention a hot sweat. Forget the cold. My heated body no longer felt the icy conditions. I couldn't believe it. There I was at Alicia's farm gate, with a loud, vibrant sign which read Sunnybrook Farm on the gatepost. I was thrilled. I nodded at the Bigfoot. He chatted away happily for a moment, pointing towards the farm. Then he turned around. I watched him gliding away, moving as gracefully as a cheetah and easily as fast. He turned around for a moment, glancing back at me one more time, nodding his head, and then he was gone. I managed to find my truck in the parking bay. I climbed in gratefully, started up the engine, and accelerated. Thanks to the Bigfoot's directions, I got a full sense of the geographic location at night, retracing my footsteps, making my way back to the minivan without much trouble at all. Alicia was thrilled to see me, marvelling at how quick I'd been, while I secretly held on to the knowledge that without the Bigfoot, I would have most certainly ended up hopelessly lost. "I'm so relieved you're back," she whispered to me. "Alec, I don't know how to thank you. Thank you so much. The people in the minivan are so wasted, they haven't got a clue what's going on. I'd be very grateful that when they're sober in the morning, if you would be so kind not to let any of them know about the hold-up. I have a reputation to keep up." I wouldn't dream of saying a word. I filled up Alicia's petrol tank for her. She was able to follow me back to the farmhouse. And then the drunk, grumbling people were offloaded, escorted to their various bedrooms. The following morning I woke up bright and early. The light was streaming through the windows, so I got up to pull the curtains to prevent my wife from waking up. It was a glorious day. I glanced out of the window to see the viridescent green fields surrounding Alicia's beguiling farmhouse, almost twinkling under the morning sun. I marvelled at how spectacular it all looked. I could see a couple of black Frisian horses grazing in the field, while the large silvery pond, surrounded by weeping willow trees, was covered with a sheen that reflected the trees. I could see a few deer gathering at the water's edge for a much-needed drink. When I went down the sweeping ornate staircase, I was struck by how quiet everything was this morning. When I entered the kitchen, Alicia was bustling around her range, busying herself frying bacon and eggs. "Oh, Alec," she said, giving me a warm, effusive hug, "you were my saving grace last night. Thank you so much for saving the day." "It's only a pleasure," I said, knowing full well that the real person who should be receiving all the praise was an unlikely hairy man, but I was hardly going to breathe a word of my encounter with anyone, not even my own wife, I might add. Needless to say, the breakfast was served at 2:30 in the afternoon. Everyone was sleeping off their hangovers and slept in very late. I'm glad to tell you that Bobby was reassuring Carter over bacon and eggs that his wife wasn't growing a beard, that she wasn't a bad cook, that he'd made up the story about the sausages in his jacket pocket that weren't as hard as bullets, while Carter was assuring Bobby that his wife wasn't a big fat cow after all. But most people listening to the two men trying to redeem themselves were not as easily fooled, for many a true thing is said in jest, especially under the influence of alcohol. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Harrison's in Portland had been opened for a year, in 1992. It was doing a flourishing, lucrative trade. The cosmopolitan, debonair restaurant was booming. People were flooding into the voguish, swanky place every single night to enjoy the wide, varied, extensive array of delicious, delectable, diverse cuisine on offer. It almost certainly helped that the owner had acquired the services of a phenomenal, sensational chef called Anton Baudelaire that had worked in auspicious culinary environments in Asia, Paris and Tuscany. So he knew a thing or two about how to produce authentic, stunning Asian, Italian and French cuisine to appeal to all range of palates, from those who enjoy plainer conventional foods to those who appreciate a more sophisticated, discerning palate. When Patrick Paget opened his distinguished acclaimed restaurant, he knew one quintessential secret that has been the making or breaking of many aspiring restaurateurs throughout North America. That is, a restaurant is only as good as its chef, which was why he searched high and low, scouring North America to look for a chef that had the experience of working in other countries, for he wanted some of his all-American dishes to have a touch of je ne sais quoi to his food, to raise his delectable, unique cuisine to a whole new level. With a chef like Anton Baudelaire, with an ingenious creative flair, this was very easily done. In the beginning, the brand new restaurant in Burnside Street, Portland, had struggled to get the word out about their amazing food. But then a humble little write-up in the Oregonian newspaper by a highly respected food journalist had taken Harrison's to new heights, rather like a young eaglet learning to soar the cobalt blue sky for the very first time in his life, as he navigates the firmament, exploring the sky with his fabulous wings, the whole world now his oyster. This literally meant you had to book a week in advance to secure your table at Harrison's. Patrick was in his early 30s, a very handsome-looking man with golden skin, high cheekbones, a square masculine jawline, distinguished slight rather Greek-looking nose, green eyes, and a full head of curly black hair. It would seem his good looks matched his affable, gregarious, warm personality that had won over many of his loyal clientele, who found Patrick to be a warm-hearted, companionable man. Since he'd been a young boy, he had always dreamed of owning his own restaurant. Now his dream had been fully realized, coming into fruition at breakneck speed. Something he had to pinch himself to ascertain that he was actually living his dream, for he never envisaged that his restaurant business would become so successful in such a short period of time. It was literally like he'd been swept off his feet. He had bought the restaurant after he'd come into a fortuitous, providential inheritance from his grandfather, of which he and his sister Leslie had benefited most profitably. Leslie had also bought a restaurant in Portland called Antonio's, which was struggling to break even, which had been a great source of anguish to his sister, who was a highly competitive character. For her, failing in life was not even an option. Unfortunately, Leslie lacked her brother's finesse, gregarious, warm-hearted personality. By contrast, she was an embittered woman, easily inclined to jealousy. She was a year older than her brother, with bobbed dark brown hair, green eyes, a heart-shaped face. She could have been pretty, but the perpetual, disagreeable, jaundiced frown that she wore on her face most days of the week, along with her stroppy attitude, short temper, would easily blow a fuse like a firecracker on the 4th of July, which made her somewhat less attractive to people in general. Even her wary staff at Antonio's distanced themselves from the acrimonious, rather acrid woman, ever afraid that the tumultuous, petulant Leslie Patchett might come down on them like a ton of bricks. It was the littlest things that would set her off. She would fly off the handle into an uncontrollable, churlish rage, of which she seemed to have no control. It was hardly a wonder she had 2 divorces behind her, as both ex-husbands claimed that they had been swallowed alive by her poisonous, fractious tongue, rather like a snake imbibing its prey whole. A waitress accidentally breaking a glass, or the chef burning something in the kitchen, would set Leslie off into an out-of-control, liverish frenzy. Even the best restaurants have to brace themselves for the odd accident from time to time, moving on with their lives as it goes with the territory. But unfortunately Leslie did not have the buoyancy and resilience to ride the storm, as keeping your head above the water is very significant in the restaurant business. For indeed you need a steely grit, a resolute passion, an inexhaustible determination to succeed. So a bad mood, perpetual tireless nagging and whinging at your staff is hardly the perfect recipe for a successful business. It was on a Saturday evening, when Harrison's was fully booked, open for business, that things were about to go horribly wrong for Patrick, on an evening he was unlikely to ever forget, that had the capacity to bring his restaurant crumbling to its knees in a matter of only minutes. Something in all the month of Sundays he would never ever have anticipated or envisaged happening to his blossoming, affluent restaurant, of which he had harnessed so many of his aspirations and dreams. The sophisticated, fashionable restaurant looked sumptuous that Saturday evening. Invariably, it always did. The round tables were beautifully graced with starched white tablecloths, gleaming glasses that had been polished to perfection. They literally sparkled. Then there was the starched linen napkins, the eclectic, tasteful white porcelain tableware, where the food was presented on fabulously interesting square or triangular-shaped plates. The green and gold-striped comfortable upholstered chairs adorned every table, offering both style, glamour, and comfort. Soon the doors of Harrison's were flung wide open for the evening. The Saturday night stream of booked customers was in full flow, all being led to their tables by the smiling, very friendly assistant manager, Shelley Longfield, who, much like her name, was a long, slender woman in her early 30s, with a long face complemented by brown chestnut long hair that she wore pinned away from her face in a knotted ponytail. The ambience in the restaurant was electric. You could hear the rise and fall of people's excited chatter, the chink of plates, the tinkle of glasses, the joyous, exuberant laughter. The waiters were clad in formal black attire, wearing starched linen aprons around their waists. Their service was absolutely impeccable, for they had learnt to make every guest feel special, pulling out chairs for their female customers, placing napkins upon knees. The special starter of the day was yuzu marinated scallops with kumquats and prosciutto. The scallops were dressed in a zingy ginger marinade, while the orange added colour to the dish. The crispy prosciutto provided a bit of savoury crunch, so texture, vibrant colour, incredible zingy flavours had been incorporated into this winning dish. "It looks like another great evening," said Patrick, rubbing his hands with contented glee. He adored his job, was thrilled to welcome some of his regulars to the Saturday night dinner. He was energised by the compliments he received from his customers, loved nothing better than his grateful guests walking away from Harrison's with happy, fulfilled stomachs, satisfied from the gastronomic explosion of nirvana. The waiters on this inauspicious evening, because that is indeed what it turned out to be, were sailing across the gleaming oakwood floor like organised boats at sea, attending to their customers' every need, offering exemplary outstanding service, popping open the wine or champagne, which they placed in silver ice buckets filled with a plethora of ice on a stand at the end of the table. They would attentively fill those thirsty fluted wine glasses with effervescent sparkling wine or champagne. They were bringing steaming plates of delicious, aesthetically delightful plated food to the table. The smells that wafted over the restaurant floor were utterly sensational and magnificent. The sound of sizzling food on plates made many stomachs grumble and many mouths salivate in eager anticipation for what was to come. For indeed a popular choice on the menu this evening was the special of scallops that Patrick was excited about. The chef's creation was marvellous, so he was one of the first to try out the scallops, and by all accounts they were absolutely delicious. But not too shortly after eating the scallops, Patrick felt distinctly queasy. He began to wonder if he actually had a seafood allergy, for there was no way those scallops were off. They received fresh scallops every day from their seafood supplier at the Flying Fish Market, a firm favourite with aspiring chefs in Portland. But his guts began to wrench inside him, as if there were invisible fists boxing away at his belly in a Mike Tyson-like match. He knew something was really off. But before he could do anything to retract those scallops from the menu, drama had already ensued at the restaurant. Let's just say it was the kind of drama that you would love to brush under the carpet surreptitiously and forget it ever happened at all. One rather portly man, a regular happy customer called Larry Cottrell, who was always at Harrison's every Saturday night, considered himself a foodie, had happily tucked into the scallops with gusto, but he got up from the table, staggering like an inebriated, intoxicated drunk, throwing up violently over the floor, to the astonishment and horror of the seated guests. Shortly after having eaten the scallops, the offensive, conspicuous, less than desirable mess was quickly cleared up by an attentive waiter on duty. But things were about to get worse, a whole lot worse. Ostensibly a thin woman with a full head of perfectly manicured curly white hair, who looked as if she was in her 80s, got up from the table to go to the ladies, but she collapsed and fainted on the floor, her face going a deathly pale shade. There was a hushed, disturbed silence in the restaurant, as all eyes focused in alarm on the poor woman, who'd only just eaten the scallops. Patrick rushed over to the woman's side, feeling for a pulse. It was incredibly weak. The woman's husband promptly dashed over to his wife, looking at Patrick with wide, frightened eyes, his aged face contorted in an expression of apprehension served on ice. "I've got a pulse," Patrick assured the relieved man. "She is breathing. How was she feeling today?" "Oh, Florence, she's been absolutely fine," said the man. "It was only after she ate the scallops on the menu that she grew deathly pale. She said she was feeling very odd." So an ambulance was immediately called. The EMTs whisked the old lady onto a stretcher with her devoted husband at her side. She was quickly ferried to the North Light Mercy Hospital in an ambulance, sirens blazing, red lights flashing. Word about the scallops spread around the restaurant like wildfire. Anyone who had ordered the scallops stopped eating them at once, happy to have their plates quickly whisked away, while Patrick got his chef Anton to remove the scallops from the menu. But many who had already eaten them were feeling nauseous and ill after the starter. The restaurant quickly cleared as people hurriedly left, rather afraid that they might have fallen victim to this inexplicable food poisoning. This was not the kind of pandemonium or chaos that Patrick desired for a Saturday night. After everything he'd worked to achieve in building up his restaurant, this was not what he wanted to happen. But with his own stomach twisting, churning and contorting, he felt too green at the gills to actually care. He quickly got into his SUV truck to drive to his country residence, about 30 minutes southwest of Portland, in the Willamite wine country, well known for its Pinot Noir, fabulous scenery, and of course slower pace of life. It was a place in later years where he would eventually run a highly esteemed new restaurant. Patrick was glad he'd left the assistant manager Shelley Longfield to close up the place and handle any of the issues concerning food poisoning. He was feeling so terribly sick as he drove through the bright lights of Portland. He couldn't wait to get back home as soon as possible to his loving wife Amber and his two 10-year-old twin boys, Mark and Peter. It was hard to focus on the road with his forehead sweating profusely, while the bitter taste of bile rose up in the back of his throat. It got considerably worse when once he was bobbing down some of the country roads that were about to be paved in asphalt, as the previous paving had become cracked very badly, so the road began to get bumpy, and the rickety journey made him feel very queasy, as the truck jiggled precariously up and down. Every single bump made the sickness more pronounced. He quickly opened the truck window to allow some fresh air to blow into the interior, offering him some relief. The fresh air helped him to feel more invigorated. He was driving past barns, meadows, farmer fields of vines, wood groves full of dogwoods, vine maples, hawthorns, ash trees and grand firs that penciled up into the dark sky like imposing, masterful giants. It was an inky black night, as is often the case when driving through rural country roads, with no street lights gracing the side of the road, like vertical poles of light. But on this particular road he was driving down, it was unusually tenebrous. It was as if the moonlight had slightly dimmed, while the twinkling stars of the firmament glittered across the sky like opulent rhinestone jewels on a sumptuous velvet evening gown. Normally Patrick would be marvelling at the alluring twilight drive, reflecting on how privileged he was to live in this part of the world, but not tonight. The sweat on his forehead was prolific. Suddenly he knew without a shadow of a doubt that he was going to be violently sick. He quickly drew his car to the side of the road, parking swiftly, making a hasty dash towards a large oak tree on the slopey embankment. He was keeling over on his hands and knees. He began to throw up violently the contents of his stomach. In between the throwing up sessions, he began to pant like a thirsty dog, his stomach twisting and contorting. It was like a never-ending vicious cycle, with only small reprieves, after which he would violently hurl all over again. His tongue tasted as bitter as gall. The back of his throat was burning, while his body had an urgent desire to regurgitate the offending food. It was while he was in the throes of his desperate elimination that he became mindfully aware that he was not alone. A tall, shadowy being only feet away from him was watching him curiously. It was only when the moonlight cascaded over the creature's body that Patrick realised what it was that he was seeing. There was not much he could do about his precarious position, whilst in the throes of a frantic, uncontrollable need to purge up all the contents of his stomach. "Oh my God," he thought, "it's a bloody Bigfoot." It seemed like the creature was transfixed by Patrick, watching him very, very inquisitively, with an incredulous, rather baffled look on his face that seemed to register concern. The creature Patrick thought must have easily been over 7 foot tall. He was burly and thick, set like a sturdy tree trunk, with long arms that fell well beyond his knees. The distinctive pyramid-shaped head was low slung upon the shoulders that were broad and very pronounced. The creature had a dark leathery face, with an exceedingly flat nose rather like a pug's, with a heavily wrinkled sloped forehead, high cheekbones, and a masculine-looking square jawline that was scantily bearded. The creature was exceedingly human, so human in fact that Patrick was quite perturbed, deciding emphatically that this anomalous creature, covered with long flowing dark hair, possessed very few primate qualities, was much more like a large, giant, powerful, lofty man. For a very brief moment the Bigfoot appeared to have gone away. Patrick was rather surprised how oddly comforted he had felt in the creature's presence, which seemed rather incongruous when being in the company of such a mighty apex predator. But for some inexplicable, unfathomable reason, he had felt the creature's companionship towards him. Then, to his amazement, the creature returned from whence he'd come, moving towards him, gliding so gracefully, almost as if he was floating on air. At first he seemed hesitant, as if overcome with a sudden timorous shyness and reticence, and then the Bigfoot, suddenly overcome with a stroke of boldness, ambled confidently towards Patrick, who was crouching down on all his fours, waiting for the next explosive episode or convulsion to make him hurl. The Bigfoot, with his huge human-like hands, sausage-sized fingers, and flat nail beds, was offering him some fragrant, spicy, aromatic leaves, one that he recognized to be wild ginger, and others of which he was not acquainted with by any manner of means. The creature indicated to Patrick to chew these leaves. He was rubbing his stomach as if to say that he would feel much better if he did. Patrick obediently began to chew the leaves, some which had a minty taste, others tasted like aniseed, and then, of course, he could taste the wild ginger. Within moments the colour returned to his face. The nausea was swept away so fast. The need to hurl was relinquished. Patrick felt energised and strong again. He stood up facing the Bigfoot, who was looking at him directly through his deep-set dark eyes that were the colour of treacle. For a moment the two of them were staring at each other, locked in an intense gaze, of which Patrick felt a faint stirring in his heart, a warm, soulful connection with this creature. He was perturbed and bewildered that despite how dauntingly huge this Bigfoot was, not for a moment or a fleeting second did he feel even a tiny tinge of fear. But he felt in those brief moments that a friendship had been born. He spoke audibly to the Bigfoot, hoping that the creature could understand or comprehend what he was saying. "Thank you so much," he said, rubbing his stomach appreciatively. "I feel much, much better. Thank you for helping me." The Bigfoot did seem to understand. He nodded at him. Patrick swears that the creature was actually smiling. He believed the creature had understood his words. The creature rubbed his stomach and then pointed at Patrick as if to say, "You are much better now." Patrick nodded and once again thanked the Bigfoot, which seemed to smile at him, while his deep-set dark eyes twinkled. The creature then nodded at Patrick, turned around and glided away, his arms moving backwards and forwards as though he was marching, and then he was gone. As Patrick slipped into the leather seats of his SUV, he marvelled at what he had just seen, and the unlikely kindness of a creature that until now he had never known existed in North America. For a moment Patrick sat back in his truck, thinking about what had transpired, meditating over his encounter, over and over again, as if pressing the remote control of a movie, and rewinding it back to the very beginning. He was in no doubt that this encounter would remain one of the most poignant experiences of his entire life, for indeed it had been a privilege and an honour to meet such a lofty, majestic creature. Finally, once he realised he was still parked on the edge of the embankment, he knew he needed to make his way home. Patrick's enthusiasm waned as he remembered the food poisoning incident at the restaurant, and then he became unduly anxious. The very next morning he rose bright and early, taking the bull by the horns,
with a savvy, prompt initiative. He called the food inspection people to report what had happened at the restaurant the previous night, so the inspectors were ordered to examine the premises henceforth. But the inspection of the premises proved that the restaurant was squeaky clean, with gleaming surfaces and impeccable good food hygiene in the cold storage. The restaurant was authorised by Food and Safety to open for business, but Patrick was terribly afraid that news about the catastrophic poisoning would spread like a wildfire, as inevitably news like this can spread fast, potentially being rather deadly for his restaurant, most especially if a report about the poisoning ended up in the local paper. He sent all the guests afflicted with food poisoning flowers, with a message that he hoped that they would get better very soon, something he was advised against doing by his lawyer, as it was more or less admitting that the restaurant was accepting responsibility for what had transpired. But Patrick did not care. He wanted to reach out to his customers with a profusive apology. In turn, they responded with gratitude, assuring him that they would definitely be returning to his restaurant. Patrick then made a difficult phone call, the most difficult phone call of all. He called up the husband whose 80-year-old wife had been taken to hospital. He was heartily relieved to hear that the elderly lady was making good and steady progress. Patrick was perturbed and flummoxed by the food poisoning incident, suspecting some kind of foul play, so he decided to take the offending food to the laboratory for immediate testing. Patrick called a friend of his called Lucas Jalowski to question all his staff about what had transpired. "I want to get to the bottom of this enigmatic situation," he told his good friend. "Something about this food poisoning doesn't feel right to me. I feel as if something nefarious is going on here. If someone intentionally wants to shut me down, I can't afford to allow this to happen again. It will destroy my business. Those scallops were very fresh. How in the hell did people get poisoned? That is the $101 question I would like you to answer." Lucas had been in the force now for over 10 long years. He was a well-respected officer in his early 30s. Patrick had known Lucas since he was 7 years old. Lucas sat down with Patrick to ask him some questions. "You believe that someone might have deliberately tried to shut you down. Why do you feel that is the case?" "Well, it's the only conclusion I can reach. I spoke to my chef, Anton. He swears he sealed up the day-old scallops, threw them into the bin. He informed me that he marinated the fresh ones, so there's no reason anyone should have got sick." "That's interesting," said Lucas. "If anyone was trying to shut you down, who do you think it would be? Do you have any enemies that you can think of?" "Not that I know of, so to speak," said Patrick, rubbing his hands through his hair. "But then again, I have been getting great reviews. Maybe a competitive restaurant out there is trying to do the dirty on me. You know, this can be a cutthroat industry. The green-eyed monster has been known to rear its ugly head from time to time. But there's no one you know personally who would like to put you out of business?" "No, not that I can think of. But I do have to tell you, Lucas, this whole poisoning thing is rather clandestine. Very, very ambiguous, if you ask me. I've received a sibylline report from the lab, who urgently tested the sample of scallops for me. Would you believe it? The sample tested positive for a poison known as ciguatera, which symptoms include abdominal cramps, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, headaches, muscular aches, itchy and numb skin. So it's food poisoning. Now the thing is, Lucas, you can't get this condition from fresh seafood. And our suppliers only sell us the freshest produce caught the very same day. So something very absurd is going on here." "Interesting," said Lucas. "This is indeed a nebulous, inscrutable case. My instincts tell me that something nefarious is definitely going on. If you don't mind, I will need to speak to your chef." "Go ahead, please do." Lucas was exceedingly impressed with the chef Anton. He was struck by how professional and astute the chef was. He was a man in his early 40s, with a wealth of culinary expertise and experience behind him. What he didn't know about food hygiene was not even worth knowing.
The police officer noticed he'd never seen such a spotless kitchen before, with surfaces so shiny you could see your reflection in them. No wonder the food safety had left them a glowing report. "I'll show you my scallops," said Anton, opening the refrigerator. "I've marinated these in ginger today. They're totally fresh." "Is there any way that you could have accidentally served the old scallops?" "Absolutely not. We serve our scallops fresh every day. Seafood goes off very quickly, especially if it's left warm. I always make sure I bag up the old scallops. I seal them up in a bag and I throw them in the bin outside." "Is there any way, Anton, that someone could have possibly removed the old scallops from the bin, swapped them over with the fresh ones?" Anton looked befuddled. "Yes, they could do that. But why would they?" he said, his words petering off, becoming almost indistinguishable. "Hypothetically, Anton, if the old scallops had been served, would they give the customers food poisoning?" "Absolutely, definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, especially after being left in the bin for a period of time. They would turn very, very quickly." "When you cook the scallops, can you tell if they're fresh if they've been marinated?" "You can always tell that scallops are fresh, but I will admit that once the ginger marinade is placed on the scallops, if they had turned, you would be very unlikely to know. The marinade of the ginger would mask the smell of the scallops being off." "Was there any time on Saturday when you and your staff may have left the kitchen unattended?" "Not that I can think of." Then Anton's brow furrowed. "Oh, yes, I did leave the kitchen for about 45 minutes with my pastry chef, Julian." "Where did you go, Anton? This is very, very important. I want you to think very clearly." "Well, Patrick's sister Leslie arrived on the scene," said Anton, lowering his voice to almost a whisper. "She owns her own restaurant, Anton's, here in Portland, you know. Same name as I've got. Ironic, really. Don't tell Patrick I told you this, but that sister of his is the most obnoxious person I've ever had the privilege to meet. No one likes her at all. I gather her restaurant has a high turnover of staff. People can't stand working for her. She's a real bully. I know a chef who left her after a month. He told me he couldn't put up with her constant nagging and bickering. You see, when you run your own kitchen, the last thing you need is the big boss meddling in your affairs, telling you how to coordinate and manage your kitchen. If you're a professional chef, you don't take kindly to that at all. Unless, of course, the criticism is justified, but it usually isn't." "Well, I suppose that makes a lot of sense," said Lucas. "So why were you distracted for 45 minutes? Did you run and hide from this dreadful woman?" "No such luck. But let's not kid. I would have liked to have done. I mean, I was run off my feet in this restaurant with all the preparations. The stocks we have to boil, the sauces, the marinades, the desserts, the vegetables that we need to prepare. So I've got not much time to go dilly-dallying around." "Well then, why did you abandon the restaurant for 45 minutes? "Well, that bloody woman Leslie. She came inside. She was bossing me and Julian around. Julian is our pastry chef. Excellent, excellent cook. He was preparing chocolate ganache, some coconut panna cottas, raspberry granitas, a tempered chocolate log. He was also making margarita tarts, some salted chocolate donuts, and espresso cheesecake. You see, he works in the kitchen late. Desserts tend to take a lot of advanced preparation, as you can imagine." "Please stop talking about food, Anton. You've got my stomach rumbling talking about all those delicious desserts. Since I've joined the force, I've packed on 20 pounds. It's all the donuts I can't resist. So tell me now, what did Leslie want from you?" She told us she had a surprise for her brother Patrick, an advance birthday present for the restaurant. It was a painting in the back of her truck. The thing weighed a ton. There were 3 parts to it. She insisted we collected them from her truck. Then she told us to hang the 3 on the wall. She brought along the hammers and picture hooks for us. So all this time, Leslie was the one in the kitchen left unattended. That's right. I knew she was hanging around in the kitchen, making herself coffee, very cosy, thank you very much, helping herself to Julian's tart au citron. So she was the only one that had access to the kitchen. That's right. But there was something rather weird that happened, which peeved Julian and me off considerably. What was that? Well, after we hung this gargantuan monstrosity of a picture up in the restaurant, that all literally did both of our backs in, it was so huge, it was divided into 3 parts to create one picture, which we had to align on the wall perfectly. Leslie came into the dining room, shook her head, said no, the picture wasn't right for her brother after all. It looked all wrong in the dining room. Could we please take it down and return it to the truck? I was beginning to feel like a bloody donkey, the way that woman was barking around orders at me. I mean, who does she think she is? I don't work for her. I work for her brother. She told us not to tell Patrick she'd been around. She was going to think of another birthday surprise for him. One more thing, Anton, before I go, said Lucas. Do you have confidence in your seafood supplier? 100%, said Anton. Their seafood is always remarkably fresh. How did your interview with Anton go? Asked Patrick eagerly. Oh, it was very enlightening indeed. Could you tell me a little bit about your sister Leslie, Patrick? Patrick looked puzzled. What has Leslie got to do with this poisoning in my restaurant? She works at her own restaurant. It's called Anton's. Tell me, how would you describe your relationship with Leslie? Well, it could be better. I love my sister. She's my flesh and blood. But she's not an easy-going character. My wife can't stand her. So, of course, it has increased the tension between us. It's very important, Anton, that you ask your sister to come over right now, at once. Before long, Leslie's truck was parked in the parking bay at Harrison's. Lucas watched the portly woman climbing out of her car with great interest. She was wearing a black jacket and matching skirt, with her blonde stylish hair that looked like it had been lacquered into place by an extra hold hairspray. So that's your sister, said Lucas, watching the woman from the window, moving towards the restaurant. That's her, said Patrick. She had bariatric surgery a couple of years ago. Used to be enormous. She could barely walk. But now she's lost a ton of weight. The bane of her life is now all that loose skin. She had several surgeries to fix that problem, but she now thinks that her scars make her look like a road accident victim. She believes she was better off fat, but I keep telling her that her blood pressure's normal, her diabetes has gone, so there are some things to be grateful for. I'm of the opinion that the best way to lose weight, said Lucas, is to eat less. Cutting your body up isn't right. Turning your stomach into the size of a fist is crazy as far as I'm concerned. What's this all about? Asked Leslie, stomping into the restaurant like a belligerent bull, being teased by a matador with a red flag. The woman looked far from happy. Her brown eyes began to squint. Her mouth turned downwards into a nasty scowl. Lucas could see what Anton meant, as the woman's aggressive energy field left him feeling more than a little unnerved. This better be good. And when I say good, it better be good. I'm a busy, busy woman. What's so urgent that it can't possibly wait? Why have you called me out here? I've got work to do. I gather you were here at the restaurant on Saturday, insisting that the pastry chef Julian and the chef Anton retrieved and hung up a huge picture for your brother Patrick. The amazing thing was that after you had exhausted the 2 poor men, you chose to take back the painting. Leslie flushed a crimson red. "Well, so what?" she said. Patrick looked baffled. "But I had my birthday 4 months ago." "Well, I must have forgotten," said Leslie. "What picture was this you were giving me?" asked Patrick, looking befuddled. "Well, you know, the contemporary 3-piece work that looks like a large whale." "But that's your prized piece of work at Anton's. Why would you ever give me that?" "I was thinking about it, that's all, but I changed my mind. It didn't look good here at all." "My name is Officer Lucas, Leslie. I'm Patrick's very good friend. I'm investigating the poisoning that happened here at Harrison's, and in regards to some scallops that were off. It's a very, very serious business indeed. People got very badly poisoned. One woman ended up being hospitalized. Her stomach had to be pumped. Now, for a woman in her 80s, that's a brutal procedure, I can assure you of that." "So," said Leslie, shrugging her shoulders sheepishly, "what the hell has this got to do with me? I know nothing about any poisoning. I can't help it if your chef is poisoning the guests. Why is that my problem?" "By all accounts, Leslie, you were the only one left alone in the kitchen for 45 minutes on Saturday, by which time you could have swapped the fresh marinated scallops for the ones that were outside in the bin going off, and you would know all about seafood poisoning, given that you work in a restaurant yourself." "What are you, Hercule Poirot or something?" said Leslie defiantly, her brown eyes evading her brother's questioning look. She brushed a finger over her mouth. "Oh, my God!" gasped Patrick. "You did do it, didn't you?" He knew when his sister was lying. From when she was a young girl, she'd always put her finger over her mouth whenever she was telling porkies. All right, I admit it. I did it. I confess. But you know what? It's because it's not fair. We both opened restaurants together. Antonio's has been struggling to break even. But you, everything is plain sailing for you, as it always is, Patrick. It's always been like that since you were a little boy. You've always been the lucky one out of the two of us. Everything goes smoothly for you. But for me, my life has been tough. Getting this restaurant off the ground has been tough. What do you think it feels like to open all night, only to get a small handful of guests? But you're booked up for weeks in advance. How do you think that makes me feel? Your restaurant gets amazing write-ups, but my restaurant hasn't even got the coverage it deserves. It's not right. It's not fair. My restaurant is equally as good as yours, if not better. Patrick was furious. So this is what it's all about. You got so green with jealousy, as our business was doing so well. You couldn't bear it, could you? You've always been competitive. You saw my restaurant doing well. You thought you'd bring us down to your level, so that our restaurant would be thrown to the curb, that word would spread like wildfire, that we poisoned our guests, which means our clients or customers would be discouraged from supporting us. You wanted to ruin my business, to ruin my family, to ruin my reputation, to ruin my restaurant. Do you realize your foolish actions could have potentially killed someone? This is a serious business. You could be charged with the intent to harm someone. I'm sorry. I guess I didn't think about what I was doing. I'm sorry, Patrick. Out, said Patrick. I don't want to look at you any more. You make me sick. Do you know why your restaurant failed? I'll tell you why it fails. None of your staff remain loyal to you. You've been through as many chefs as I've had hot dinners. You're always interfering with the way things are run in the kitchen. It's a little like me telling a dentist how to drill my teeth when I don't know a thing about dentistry. You know nothing about cooking. Some of the chefs you've hired have been dreadful. I've always told you a bad chef equals bad food, bad reputation. It all goes hand in hand. Take a long look at yourself, Leslie. When do you ever smile? You're always bullying everybody around. Those are the reasons your restaurant can't ride above the storm. It's not rocket science, you know." "I'm not going to stand here and listen to this drivel," said Leslie, storming out of the restaurant, dashing to her truck, putting her foot down on the accelerator and driving away as fast as she could. "Perhaps I was a little hard on her," said Patrick. "I don't think so," said Lucas. "Sometimes a few home truths are needed for people to get their act together. At least now you know who was responsible for causing the poisoning in the restaurant. I will leave it up to you as how you proceed, if you want to take this matter any further." "That won't be necessary. I can weather this storm. Besides, my sister is still my flesh and blood. Despite everything, I love her. You don't have to like those you love. But my hope is that she may learn a valuable lesson over this episode, that being jealous only drags you down." To cut a long story short, for some reason a journalist had got wind of the truth behind the poisoning in Harrison's, and the report in the newspaper read, "The highly revered restaurants Harrison's in Portland, situated on Burnside Street, with the Green Harrod-style awnings on the outside, owned by Patrick Paget, recently opened a year ago, on June the 20th, 1992, soaring to success within 3 months of opening their doors. It has been getting glowing reports ever since, thanks to the esteemed chef Anton Boulader, who has worked in Asia, Paris and Tuscany. The restaurant had a very unfortunate incident 2 days ago on Saturday night dinner service that threatened to tarnish this fabulous restaurant's illustrious image and exemplary reputation. Indeed, the restaurant is so successful that they are taking advance bookings weeks, sometimes months in advance. The food on the menu is diverse and exciting, suited to please the discerning, sophisticated palate and those who prefer to indulge in standard American fare, cooked to perfection, with dishes on the menu that include grilled calamari with watermelon, olives, goat's curd, crispy vine leaves, followed by roast pork belly with roasted crackling, char-grilled peach salsa and mashed potatoes, followed by vanilla panna cotta with rhubarb and ginger. It was the hors d'oeuvres on Saturday's menu, the special of the day that put Harrison's in the spotlight in an inauspicious way. Yuzu marinated scallops with ginger and crispy prosciutto. It was this menu that threatened to tear the restaurant's reputation wide apart, as multiple guests became violently sick, with serious cases of food poisoning. One 80-year-old woman, Florence Markham, was hospitalized, but is reported to be making an excellent recovery. It would seem the guilty culprit behind the poisoning was the owner, Patrick Paget's own sister, Leslie Paget, formerly Leslie Donovan, who is the owner of Antonio's in Portland, a restaurant that has not yet made its mark. It would appear that sibling jealousy reared its ugly head. Leslie was reported to admit replacing the fresh scallops with the 2-day-old scallops that had been thrown out. As the older scallops had been marinated, the chef Anton was unable to discern that the scallops were not fresh. "I am very disappointed with my sister's duplicitous actions," admitted Patrick, "and of course the distress she caused to so many of my clients. But she is my sister, so naturally I forgive her." When Leslie was asked to comment on her guileful actions, she refused to make any comments. So our advice is for you to feel confident that an evening spent at Harrison's will ensure you will leave having had an outstanding culinary experience. Don't be put off by this unfortunate incident, which Patrick says is exceedingly unlikely to ever happen again. All things considered, and on a final note, I'm very glad to report to you that business at Harrison's continued to boom and prosper. If anything, the food poisoning incident meant that the business skyrocketed to greater success. So maybe there is some truth that there's no such thing as bad publicity. As far as Leslie was concerned, she managed to overcome the green-eyed monster. In the years that followed, Antonio's was doing a great trade. But to date, Leslie has retired from the restaurant business. It would seem that she did learn some invaluable lessons in toning down her aggressive stance towards her staff. As far as Patrick was concerned, if it hadn't been for a bout of extreme sickness, he would not have encountered the hairy man, an experience that has left an indelible footprint on his life. And when we talk about footprints, it's of the very large kind. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Meryl and I live in the city of Portland and have lived and grown up in this incredible part of the world all of my life. My extraordinary Bigfoot encounter happened to me in 2018 in an exquisite dreamy woodland area in the Oregon countryside, where the last thing that you would expect to encounter would be a Bigfoot. But then Bigfoots do have an uncanny way of turning up in the most unlikely of places when you're least expecting an encounter. If you're looking for the critter, you mark my words, you'll never ever find him, because that's the way the cookie always crumbles. I recently began a nursing career working at a Portland hospital, and so I was renting out a room in a very large, exquisite home in a peaceful green leafy suburb known as Alamanda that possesses exquisite views of downtown Portland, the Willamette River and the Cascade Mountains. Many of the turn-of-the-century houses located in this picturesque, charming street are home to generations of families that have lived in these homes since the early 50s. Some of these historic treasures have been restored to their former original glory, so the street is naturally full of large properties that are in pristine condition with so much character, charm and mysterious intrigue. I adore this neighbourhood because it is so serene, quiet and peaceful, which I love, and there are people walking and jogging everywhere. It has very sizable sidewalks, ubiquitous trees, emerald green manicured lawns and loads of green leafy parks, and yet it's in close proximity to shops and other amenities, so it really is a prime idyllic location. I was renting out my own bedroom as a live-in tenant in this large, recently restored colonial-styled home in Alamanda, where the upper floors were all bedrooms and the family room and kitchen were on the first floor, which is ideal for tenants. There were 3 of us nurses living together under this large, cosy roof, with all of us possessing our very own spacious bedrooms that had been sumptuously decorated, along with our own luxurious sooty bathroom en suites. We were renting and sharing this awesome living space with an elderly 80-year-old lady called May, who was a lively, humorous and fun-loving person with a quirky sense of humour who had lived in this gorgeous house virtually all her life. May's husband had passed away several years earlier and her kids flown the nest, so it really was a large mansion for one person to handle all on their own, which was why she decided to let out rooms in her lavish abode, as she believed emphatically that sharing her space with some young blood would be incredibly good for her. We all helped supervise around the home with an organised rota system where we all took turns in doing the shopping, laundry, cooking and cleaning, and even some yard work to keep the house in pristine condition. May's place was like an extension of our very own homes, because that was how welcome she made us feel, living in her elaborate, plush and splendiferous dwelling. May was not your typical 80-year-old woman, but was much more like a young person wearing an elderly skin. To look at, you would never believe her to be a day over 70, as her peachy complexion was both firm and unlined, and her blue eyes sparkled with life. She had the smile of a Hollywood star, with the most perfect set of pearly white teeth, but they were all her own, and her body was in great shape, with no signs of early arthritis or weakening of bones that you invariably see in older people. Despite her advancing years, she was robust, energetic and full of beans. May had 2 beloved cats in her life that were like her very own children, and they quite literally adored her. Every evening while we watched TV together, both those cats would lie on her lap and purr contentedly. One of her dearly beloved cats was called Jasper, and the other was called Catkins, and they were both marmalade cats with the most adorable personalities. May would often tell us that they brought her so much joy into her life that she couldn't even imagine her life without them. "You know what I love about my fairy children," she would say over and over again. "They never abandon you like your own family does when they fly the nest, and you barely ever hear from them again. My 2 flesh and blood children hardly ever contact me these days. They're so busy with their lives in Boston, raising their own families. They haven't got time for a silly old bat like me." "You're not a silly old bat," I protested. "My beautiful cats love me so unconditionally, without ever judging me, and they're with me every day of my life,
and they're the greatest source of comfort I've ever known. They're here for all of us, I assured May, because cats always make life so much richer and fuller. I adore coming back from nursing and seeing Jasper and Catkins curled up on the couch because it's such a homely feeling, and just watching them makes me relax, especially after a stressed day at work, dealing with difficult, tumultuous patients, let me tell you. It's true, said Caroline, who was one of May's tenants. I was told once that people would not be able to manage the stresses of everyday life without the addition of animals, because life would be pretty much impossible to live without them. It's true, I reflected. I heard once that people who have pets actually live longer and healthier lives than people who don't, because animals have been proven to literally lower blood pressure and reduce levels of stress. Well, maybe that's why I'm in such good shape, May reflected, as she submersed the dirty dishes from our dinner into a large hot sink of bubbling, foaming water and began to wash them with a brush. And once she'd cleaned them, she handed them over to me to dry with a towel, while Caroline finally replaced them back in the cupboards where they belonged. The doctor tells me I'm a very healthy individual, May continued. No high blood pressure or diabetes, and never had a sick day in my life, she declared proudly. I can't say any of my friends have been quite so lucky as I have, she said. I think these cats have a lot to do with my good health, so there's something in what you say. It's because animals increase your level of immunity, I told her. It's a very well-established fact, and has been scientifically proven. I notice that when I'm nursing sick patients who've pets of their own, they always recover so much more speedily than those who don't. They also can't wait to get back to their animals, and they talk about them incessantly when they're in hospital. Well, that makes perfect sense to me, said May. Oh, talking about animals, that reminds me, she said, regarding me with a concerned expression on her face. My cats both need their vaccinations done, but I like to take them to my local vet, Mr. Mandel, who used to be close by, but is now based in the countryside, which is about 30 minutes out of town. My cats know him very well, you see, and I'd rather not use anybody else. Could you take them for their yearly appointment for me? I'd be so terribly grateful. I know it's a little way out, but as I don't drive, it would be such a help. I'd happily take them for you, May, I told her. I have a day off tomorrow, so it wouldn't be any trouble at all. And besides, a drive in the countryside would be a very pleasant excursion for me. It's good to get out of town. I felt happy to do May a favour, as she did so much for us as tenants, making us delicious meals, cakes and homemade breads, and was often seen doing our ironing and washing for us, and going out of her way to make our lives a lot easier. It was the least I could do to extend a helping hand, and I was thrilled to return a favour. The following morning I packed the 2 ginger cats into their baskets in the back of my car, and off I went to the veterinary surgery, which was about 30 minutes outside town, and in a stunning, beautiful location. I used my GPS to find the surgery that was like a bright pink building that was attached to the front of a residential farmhouse. The whole landscape was surrounded by exquisite views, beautiful green pastures, and vast areas of dreamy forest, consisting of tall, statuesque, rather imposing trees. I gather the vet was now in his advancing years, but was still practising and decided to move away from Portland to this idyllic part of the world, and most of his regulars who had visited his surgery in downtown Portland were willing to make the extra 30-minute trip because he was such a trusted and respected vet. May was one of his long-time clients who had visited his practices for over 25 years and had absolutely no desire to change her vet any time soon. As I grabbed the cat baskets out of the back of the car, I could tell that both ginger tabbies had grown restless and weary from the journey and seemed agitated and far from pleased, as they were protesting and meowing furiously, especially Catkins, who was making a huge commotion. Suddenly, to my horror, Catkins managed to push open the basket with her paws, and she escaped over the open road, where she ran as fast as she could, bounding into the forest like greased lightning, and was gone from my sight. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. Surely I'd locked her securely in her basket. The horrendous shock that had just transpired before my eyes seemed so hauntingly surreal. It hit me so hard, like a block of ice being thrust in my face. My heart sank into feelings of harrowing despair and hopelessness. How could this have happened to me? Catkins was May's world. How could I possibly return home without her cat? I knew this was a monumental catastrophe, as far as I was concerned. May would be absolutely devastated to lose her cat like this, in a situation that so easily could have been avoided, if only I'd been paying attention and locked the cats safely in their basket. I couldn't believe I'd been so careless, clumsy and cack-handed. If I behaved in this negligent way as a nurse, I would ultimately lose my job in a heartbeat. Imagine if I forgot to inject a patient on time, or I ultimately gave them the wrong pills. I would be in heaps of trouble. Yet I couldn't be trusted to deliver a cat safely to the surgery. I was furious with myself. It was inconceivable returning home without catkins, because it would quite literally break May's heart. How could I disappoint the lovely old lady, who was more like a mother to me than my own mother had ever been? I had never felt so dreadfully responsible for something in my entire life as I did now. My generous favour had turned into a ghastly nightmare from which there seemed no escape. What in God's name was I going to do now? "You'll never find that cat in that wooded area," the vet assured me. "You'll have to put it down to one of those dreadful accidents that invariably happens sometimes. Looking for her in those woods will be like looking for a needle in a haystack. I'd leave it if I were you, because you'll only be wasting your time. You'll never ever find her." "I cannot do that," I told the vet. "Do you not see that it's my fault the cat actually escaped? Because I failed to lock the basket securely. I need to find that cat, because Catkins is like a child to May. It would absolutely destroy her if I returned home empty-handed, without her beloved baby. I couldn't live with myself." Oh dear," said the vet. "This is the problem when people love animals too much. These dreadful things happen. Surely she'll understand. I've known May for a very long time, and she's a lovely, lovely lady with a very generous heart. If anyone can forgive you, she surely can." "Look," I said to the vet, "I know you mean well, but I can't forgive myself if I don't at least try and retrieve the cat. He ran into the woods over there across the road, and I'm going in there after him. There's nothing more to be said for it." "Good luck," said the vet. "You're going to need it. I'm glad I'm not wearing your shoes this morning." I left Jasper in the pet's care to receive his annual vaccinations, and quickly dashed over the road to the wooded area where Catkins had gone missing. "Oh, please, God," I prayed in my heart. "I haven't asked you for anything before. Well, not really. But now I'm asking you for a huge miracle, to save an elderly woman from breaking her heart. Please help me find Catkins. It's a matter of extreme urgency, God. It's a matter of life and death." As I entered the beautiful wooded area, it was like being immersed in a magical wonderland, as the woods were so serene and peaceful, with tall statuesque trees that rose up in the firmament like masterful green giants. I noticed that there was red alder, dogwood, white oaks and maple trees, and they were all impressive mature trees with substantial girths. The forest was covered with pretty green undergrowth, from ferns and rambling greenery, some that was flowering with pretty pink flowers, and the whole area was alive with pretty birdsong. It was all so enchanting and idyllic that for a moment I forgot why I was in the pretty forest in the first place. The woods were sheltered from the midday sun by a cooling canopy created by the enveloped leafy branches that covered my head. "Catkins," I called. "Pussy, pussy, Catkins." For a long while I walked through the forest searching for the cat and looking up tree branches to see if I could see her there, but she was nowhere in sight, and she was not responding to my desperate calls. "Catkins! Catkins! Catkins!" Suddenly, to my amazement, as I was looking up a tree, I observed this huge humanoid silhouette staring down at me from a great height. He was standing on a branch with the agility and grace of a monkey, but this thing was not a monkey. It was looking down at me with curious interest in very bright, congenial brown eyes. It was the strangest creature that I've ever observed in my entire life. It was covered from head to toe with long auburn-coloured hair that appeared rather matted and tangled, which was a pity because the hair was beautiful. It looked like a hairy human with ape-like influences, and I realised almost at once that it was a Bigfoot. I had heard about these creatures before, but I'm afraid I was never a believer in the existence of such mysterious critters. But now here I was, staring at one of these creatures face to face, and there was no doubt that this was a Bigfoot. I could hardly believe it. Only recently I'd been really horrible to my little brother, teasing him for his Bigfoot poster on the wall, and I told him that Bigfoot was as spurious as Father Christmas and the Tooth Fairy, and there was no such creature in existence. "But they are real," he had protested, his eyes filling with tears. "Why are you being so cruel?" My mother also scolded me. "Honestly, Merrill, why are you being so mean to your little brother? If he believes in Bigfoot, why are you trying to rob him of his fantasy?" "Because, Mum," I said, "why would you want to fill his little head with nonsense? The critter is not real. It's as simple as that." "Well, that's what they said about the panda bear once, and that wasn't long ago," said my mother. "And there were people like you all saying that the critter didn't exist, until all the doubters were put in their place as they eventually proved that the panda was indeed real." Was this the universe now poking a face at me, I wondered, and having a huge dig, because I was so wrong? Bigfoot was real, and now I owed my brother a huge apology. Although the creature was very large and imposing, with a very sturdy, powerful build and overlong arms, with a typical cone-shaped head, at no time was it remotely aggressive or hostile towards me, but looked at me with an angst, rather confused expression on its face that seemed to say, "Who are you? What are you doing here? And what do you want?" It seemed more perturbed and surprised as to my presence in these woods, which I guess was not rarely frequented by many people. I looked up at the Bigfoot, and our eyes locked in a warm embrace. I sensed the creature was a kindly, gentle soul. It's difficult for me to estimate his weight, height, or girth, but at a guess I would say he was about 6 foot tall, 3 foot wide, and 500 pounds. Suddenly my attention was diverted away from the Bigfoot, as in my peripheral vision I saw a ginger-haired creature crawling up a large tree yards away from where I was standing. At first I thought it was a red squirrel, but to my amazement it was Catkins. I could tell by the cat-like paw and claws that dug into the tree trunk as he glided up the branch. I ran over to the tree in absolute delight and called out to Catkins, "Catkins, Catkins, it's me, come down! Catkins, it's me, come down, Catkins!" Catkins' ginger head peered down at me from a great height, and she refused to come down. It was like she was saying, "I'm up here, and I refuse to budge." She had that smug, self-satisfied look on her cheeky feline face, and at the best of times was a very stubborn cat, with a mind all of her own. How on earth was I going to get this obstinate, mischievous ginger tabby down? I kept calling and calling her, and "Catkins, please come down! Catkins, please come down!" I was almost crying, I was so desperate, and I was so focused on my mission in hand, I'd almost forgotten the Bigfoot standing in the next tree observing the strange commotion unfolding before his very eyes. He looked a little confused, baffled, and muddled by my obsession with a strange bundle of ginger hair perched on the tree branch that was staring down at me with a churlish expression on his face, almost as if it was saying, "I'm not coming down." The Bigfoot remained standing on the tree branch, watching me intently with wide eyes, trying to make sense of what I was actually doing. I suddenly had an idea, and actually pointed to the cat in the tree and to my cat basket, and proceeded to act out to the Bigfoot, getting the cat and putting it in the basket. I did this several times. Maybe the Bigfoot would be able to help me retrieve Catkins. The Bigfoot seemed to understand, and made a chattering sound, and he literally dived from one tree branch to another until he was standing yards away from Catkins. The way he moved was so effortless, like a orangutan in a tree. He was breathtaking to watch. Catkins got the fright of her life to see the hairy humanoid standing yards away from her. Her ears went right back, and her hair stood on end. She virtually doubled in size in an instant, and began to growl and lash out with her paws at the creature. I think she thought the Bigfoot was going to eat her, and she put up a huge fight. But the Bigfoot was not easily put off, and grabbed her in his huge sausage-like hands. I watched in awe as the Bigfoot jumped onto the ground and landed on his padded paws, or feet, rather like my cat, and he put Catkins into her cat basket, which I immediately locked. This was such a miracle. Not only did I get the cat back, but this mythical creature that so many of us refuse to believe is real helped me retrieve May's cat. I could hardly believe it. I tried to thank the creature, who bounced back to his tree and stood there watching me as I left the forest. I bet he was wondering why I was so interested in this angry, volatile ginger cat. When I returned to the surgery with Catkin in my basket, the vet nearly had a heart attack. "How the hell did you manage to find her?" he asked me in amazement. "I'd have put money on you never finding her again." "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I said, with a mischievous twinkle in my eyes. I was not about to divulge my Bigfoot experience to him. I was finding the whole event difficult to process myself. When I returned the 2 ginger cats to May, she thanked me for doing her a huge favour. "I knew I could rely on you, Meryl," she said. "You never ever let me down." Can you believe it? I actually said, "Any time. It wasn't any trouble at all." That night I did some research on Bigfoot, and I realised how privileged I was to meet such an incredible creature, and I also learnt about the act of gifting, and so after a little shopping in Portland, I brought a large basket of mixed fruit and nuts, and took them to the area where I'd seen the Bigfoot, and left them under the tree. I called out my cat's name, and then suddenly he appeared out of nowhere. I know he recognised my voice, and immediately responded to my call. I was amazed. I pointed to the basket of fruit, and he grabbed it happily and gave me a delighted look, and made an excited chattering sound, and glided away into the forest, whistling happily to himself. He was absolutely elated with my gift. I am elated that we got Catkins back. I'm glad to tell you that I made amends with my little brother as well, and told him that I did believe in Bigfoot, but I was not going to tell him about my encounter that had changed my mind. That would be going way too far for me. So there you are. That's my story. Well, Meryl, I just want to thank you so very much for that incredible, incredible story. You know, so many of us who've lost animals can really identify with how you must have felt in that moment. But I'm so proud of you that you just were determined to find your cat. And you did. You found May's cat for her, and you brought it safely back with the help of Bigfoot. And what an extraordinary creature that he actually understood that you needed his help.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.